If you are someone who enjoys quiet mysteries, stories that unfold slowly, where every small detail matters, and where deduction replaces drama, this is the perfect story for you. Tonight, we return to the English countryside, to the misty moors of Dartmoor, where something unusual has happened. A famous racehorse has disappeared. A trusted trainer has been found dead, and the answers seem scattered like the fog that rolls over the fields. But as always, when confusion reigns, there is one man whose calm logic and quiet observation can bring order to chaos. Join us now for a gentle, detailed, and thoughtful journey into one of Sherlock Holmes's most intriguing cases. Let your mind settle. Let the tension of the day drift away, and follow the slow and steady unraveling of the adventure of Silver Blaze. The fading light of late autumn cast a long golden glow over the streets of London. There was a crisp bite in the air, the kind that made passers-by pull their coats tighter and quicken their steps along the cobbled sidewalks. Inside the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, however, the air remained still and heavy, the faint smell of pipe tobacco lingering from earlier in the day. Sherlock Holmes sat motionless near the window, one long leg crossed over the other, with his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. His fingers tapped slowly, rhythmically on the arm of his chair. He had not spoken for nearly half an hour. Only the occasional crackle from the fireplace and the distant murmur of horse-drawn carriages drifting up from the street below offered any reminder. Continued. Dr. Watson, by occupying himself. The paper rustled softly in his hands as he flipped through, though his eyes frequently drifted toward Holmes, studying the familiar silhouette of his friend. Watson knew that particular stillness well. It was the stillness that came when Holmes was waiting, not for inspiration, opportunity. Watson's attention paused on a headline spread across the center column, printed in bold and unmistakable type. The words seemed to pulse on, demanding to be read aloud. Silver Blaze missing. The favorite for the Wessex Cup has disappeared without trace from King's Pylon training stables in Dartmoor. Watson lowered the page, glancing toward the Wessex Cup, one of the most anticipated racing events of the season. The horse in question, Silver Blaze, had become something of a national treasure, undefeated in every race he had entered, known for his distinctive silver-white blaze running down the center of his face, and blessed with a speed and power that left other horses trailing hopelessly. People across the country had pinned their hopes, and in many cases their money, on the belief that Silver Blaze would once again cross the finish line first. The article continued with alarming detail. The horse had vanished sometime during the night from the King's Pylon stables, located on the wild and open terrain of Dartmoor in Devonshire. Even more unsettling was the news that the horse's trainer, John Straker, had been found dead on the moor just hours after the disappearance was discovered. The police had offered few details, but speculation was already rampant. Watson read aloud some of the more dramatic lines from the article, noting the confusion, the fear, and the growing public fascination with the mystery. Rumors swirled about possible foul play, rival stables, and gambling conspiracies. The racing community was in an uproar. Bookmakers were adjusting odds wildly, and ordinary citizens with no stake in horse racing at all found themselves following the story with morbid curiosity. Holmes remained silent. His eyes stayed fixed on a point somewhere beyond the window glass, though Watson could sense the familiar tension growing beneath his calm exterior. The silence stretched until late afternoon shadows began to climb the walls of the sitting room. Then, almost as if on cue, there came a knock at the Mrs. Hudson's footsteps moved quickly across the hall, followed by her voice, carrying softly upward as she called out that a telegram had arrived. Mr. Holmes. Holmes took the folded note from Watson without a word, breaking the seal and scanning the message with eyes that moved faster than Watson could follow. There was a pause. Then Holmes spoke, his voice low but steady. "Urgent request from Colonel Ross. He wants me in Dartmoor immediately. Matter serious and pressing." Watson set down his paper. Colonel Ross, the owner of Silver Blaze. It seemed the mystery had reached Holmes sooner than expected. Holmes rose from his chair with deliberate movements, crossing the room to retrieve his coat and hat. His manner remained unhurried, but Watson noticed the small, unmistakable signs that his friend's mind was already racing ahead. "Pack for the country, and bring your heaviest overcoat. Dartmoor is not known for its hospitality this time of year." Watson moved quickly to gather his things, already familiar with the ritual of sudden departure. Within the hour, the two men stood at Paddington Station, waiting on the platform as steam hissed from the engine and passengers bustled past with muffled footsteps on the cold stone floor. As the train began its long journey westward, cutting through the misty outskirts of London and rolling into the open countryside, Holmes sat with his head resting lightly against the cushioned window frame, eyes closed but mind clearly working through the early facts. Watson, seated across, stared out at the pitting fields, wondering how a horse could simply vanish into thin air, and how a trusted trainer could wind up dead on a lonely moor in the middle of the night. Night fell over the landscape as the train pressed on toward Dartmoor, carrying with it two men, 1,000 unanswered questions, and the quiet, growing certainty that beneath the headlines and rumors, something far stranger and far more human waited to be discovered. The journey to Dartmoor unfolded under a heavy curtain of low-hanging clouds, casting the distant hills in muted shades of gray and blue. As the train rattled westward, the landscape gradually shifted from the tidy farmlands of the English countryside to the vast, open, and often unforgiving stretches of the moor. Thin lines of stone walls crisscrossed the fields, disappearing into distant fog. Lone trees stood bent from years of harsh winds, their skeletal branches clawing toward the pale sky. Holmes sat near the window for much of the journey, one hand resting loosely on his knee, the other holding a small notebook in which he scribbled brief, cryptic observations from time to time. His face remained still, but Watson, seated opposite, could detect the faint tension building in his friend's pocket. The subtle coil of energy that always appeared before Holmes immersed himself fully in it. By the time they arrived at the small station closest to King's Pyland, the late afternoon had already deepened into twilight. A light drizzle clung to the air, giving the landscape a damp, cold stillness. Waiting on the platform was a hired carriage, sent by Colonel Ross himself, with a coachman whose tight grip on the reins betrayed the unease that had settled over the estate in recent days. The ride to the stables took them along winding country lanes, bordered by stone fences and patches of untamed grass. The wheels of the carriage jolted over uneven ground, and the horses pulled with anxious, restless movements, as if sensing the tension that lingered over the moor. Holmes remained silent for most of the ride, observing every feature of the landscape, the flattened patches of grass, the distant silhouette of grazing sheep, the narrow footpaths threading off into the wilderness. Dartmoor stretched wide in every direction, its loneliness pressing in on them with every pass. As they approached the stables, Watson caught his first glimpse of the gathered figures near the training ground. A small group of men stood together in subdued conversation, their expressions grim. Stable hands in worn jackets kept their distance, speaking in low tones among themselves. Nearby, a uniformed officer from the local police stood with arms crossed, his eyes sweeping the surroundings with a mixture of frustration. Colonel Ross emerged from the main house as the carriage came to a tall, narrow-faced man with sharp features and deep lines etched along his forehead. He carried himself with the rigid bearing of military discipline. Yet beneath that surface, Watson detected a deep worry that weighed on him like an anchor. Without waiting for formal introductions, Colonel Ross stepped toward Holmes with the air of a man desperate for answers. "I am relieved you came so quickly. This entire business has been a nightmare. My horse, my poor Silver Blaze, and now John Straker, dead." The colonel's voice faltered slightly as he said the name, as if still unable to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation. Holmes nodded, offering no immediate comment, and gestured toward the stables. "If you please, Colonel. Before any details, I should like to see the scene for myself." They were led first to the area where Silver Blaze had been kept. The King's Pyland stables stood at the edge of the property, their wooden beams darkened by years of exposure to wind and rain. The air inside still carried the unmistakable smell of horses, warm, earthy, and heavy with the scent of straw. Yet the central stall, the one reserved for Silver Blaze, stood conspicuously empty. Only a scattered trail of hay and disturbed bedding offered any evidence that the champion racehorse had stood there just nights before. Holmes moved through the stables with measured steps, running his fingertips lightly along the wooden rails, observing the condition of the locks and latches, pausing near the doors to examine the earth, where hoof prints and boot marks crisscrossed in faint, overlapping patterns. His eyes drifted toward the feed buckets, the tack room, the placement of tools, each detail observed and stored without comment. From there they were taken to the moor where Straker's body had been found. The wind had picked up by then, and the dampness in the air seemed to settle into Watson's coat as they crossed the open field. The spot lay nearly half a mile from the stables, beyond a low ridge that shielded it partially from view. A cluster of yellowing grass marked the place, still flattened where the body had rested. The ground remained soft from recent rain, leaving deep impressions where footprints, some still clearly visible, crisscrossed the area. Holmes crouched near the site, inspecting the disturbed earth with quiet intensity. Watson remained a few steps behind, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon, where the moor stretched endlessly in every direction, dotted only by occasional shrubs and jagged rocks. The details surrounding the troubling. Straker had been found lying, his head showing a single fatal blow, one powerful enough to fracture the skull. The weapon had not been found. Instead, close to his right hand, police had discovered a small, delicate knife with a thin, sharp blade, more suited to fine, precise work than to any sort of physical struggle. Holmes studied the spot where the knife had been recovered, noting its position relative to the footprints and the line of Straker's foot. He examined the marks left by Straker's boots, comparing them with the smaller, lighter prints nearby, likely from one of the police constables, judging by the newer tread pattern on their soles. Watson watched as Holmes pulled a magnifying lens from his coat and leaned closer to the soil, studying something too small for the naked eye to see. After several moments, Holmes stood again, brushing the dirt from his knees with slow, deliberate movement. Colonel Ross and the local inspector approached, their expressions expectant. Holmes spoke at last, his tone calm, but weighted with observation. "The ground here tells me much, gentlemen, yet it speaks quietly, and we must listen carefully if we hope to understand what really transpired on this moor." The group stood in silent agreement and feeling the chill in the air, not just cold wind sweeping across the open land, but from the knowledge that the mystery was far from simple. Somewhere in the vast gray expanse of Dartmoor, a champion racehorse had vanished without a trace, and a trusted trainer had met a violent, untimely end. As the light continued to fade, Holmes turned back toward the stables, already assembling the first threads of deduction in his mind. Watson followed closely behind, knowing that this was only the beginning. The following morning brought with it a cold, steady drizzle that veiled the Dartmoor landscape in a thin silver mist. The low-hanging clouds hovered close to the pressing down on the hills and valleys with a the air smelled of wet earth and distant wood smoke, the kind of air that clung to skin and clothing long after a person returned indoors. Inside the modest drawing room of Colonel Ross's country house, a small group had gathered by the fireplace, each man standing or sitting in tense, restless posture. Colonel Ross paced near the window, glancing frequently out toward as though expecting Silver Blaze to come galloping home at any moment, out of the fog and back into his military precision was breaking down under the weight of personal loss and public pressure. Seated nearby was Inspector Gregory from Scotland Yard, a tall and lean man with sharp cheekbones and a permanent crease between his brows that spoke of many sleep nights spent over unsolved cases. His uniform was neat but showed signs of hurried travel, his boots still carrying traces of Dartmoor mud from the morning's walk across the fields. Holmes stood with his back to the fire, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, the other tucked loosely into the pocket of his overcoat. His expression remained unreadable, though Watson, seated to the side with his notebook on his knee, observed the slightest narrowing of Holmes's eyes whenever new information was spoken aloud. Inspector Gregory was reviewing the known facts of the case in his methodical, factual tone. Though Watson had always respected the men of Scotland Yard, he also knew that Holmes had little patience for their habit of collecting observations without extracting meaning from. The inspector cleared his throat and began reciting the sequence of events with bureaucratic precision. At approximately 5 o'clock in the morning 2 days ago, one of the stable lads arrived at King's Pyland to begin his duties. He immediately noticed that Silver Blaze's stall was empty. The alarm was raised, and within the hour, nearly every man on the estate was combing the moor in search of the missing horse. By 8 o'clock, the body of John Straker was discovered lying face down in a shallow depression near the edge of the moor, about half a mile from the stables. There was evidence of a violent struggle. Straker had suffered a single fatal blow to the skull. The weapon was initially unknown, but near his right hand we found a small surgical knife with a fine, narrow blade. Inspector Gregory paused for emphasis, then continued. Later that morning, we apprehended Fitzroy Simpson. He had been spotted loitering near the training grounds the night before the disappearance. Known in certain circles as a professional gambler and a man of questionable morals, Simpson was found carrying a curious assortment of items: a heavy walking stick, a book of betting odds, and most notably, a small packet of opium-laced meat, which we presume was intended for the horse. Watson glanced at Holmes, curious to see his reaction, but Holmes remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the inspector's shoulder. Colonel Ross interrupted at this point, his voice brittle with controlled anger. Simpson was seen more than once near my property in recent. He had no business being here. I want him charged and dealt with swiftly. Holmes raised a single finger, signaling for. His voice, when he spoke, was low and measured. Before we accept conclusions, let us first consider the evidence carefully. What was Simpson's explanation, Inspector Gregory? He claims to have wandered onto the property by accident. He says he was lost while walking toward Tavistock. He admits to bringing the drugged meat, but refuses to say more. His story is, Holmes stepped away from the piece, moving slowly toward the table where a large map of Dartmoor had been unrolled. He studied the contours and landmarks with quiet focus. "And what about the dog?" Holmes asked without looking. The inspector blinked in confusion. "The dog? Do you mean the guard dog at the stables?" "Exactly." Holmes's tone was still gentle, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of challenge. The inspector hesitated before answering. "The dog did nothing. The stable hands reported that it was quiet all night. There was no barking." Holmes allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to pass across his lips, but he quickly masked it as he bent closer to. Watson observed the room carefully, sensing the subtle shift in mood. Holmes had latched onto something, some detail that seemed unimportant to others, but carried weight in his mind. After several moments of silence, Holmes straightened and addressed both. "I should like to visit the precise spot where Straker's body was found, and after that, I shall require a full inspection, every stall, every latch, every footprint, no matter how small or faint. I also wish to see the walking stick and the contents found on Mr. Simpson's person." Colonel Ross seemed anxious to press for further opinions, but Holmes offered him no more than that. Later, as they prepared to leave the room and step out once again onto the wet, cold moor, Watson noticed the familiar gleam returning to Holmes's eyes. It was the look of a man who had begun to see the outline of a solution where others still saw only. The fog continued to roll over the hills as they left the house, swallowing their figures one by one until they vanished into the gray distance, drawn by the silent pull of the mystery that lay waiting somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary. The morning fog hung low over Dartmoor like a heavy veil, clinging to the heather and coarse grass, the stubborn chill that seeped in. The air was thick with moisture, and a faint metallic scent drifted from the nearby fields, where dew settled heavily on the ground. Despite the bleakness of the landscape, Sherlock Holmes appeared invigorated by the environment, as though the raw, untamed character of the moor fed his mental faculty. The walk from the colonel's house to the temporary holding cell where Fitzroy Simpson was being kept took nearly half an hour. The path wound through narrow lanes bordered by moss-covered stone walls, past isolated cottages whose smoking chimneys stood like lonely sentinels against the gray sky. Holmes walked ahead, his long coat trailing behind him, while Watson and Inspector Gregory followed close behind, their steps muffled by the soft, wet earth. The holding cell was little more than a converted storeroom behind the local inn, with iron bars hastily fixed across a small window and a heavy wooden door reinforced with metal bands. Inside, Fitzroy Simpson sat slumped on a narrow bench, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly despite the relatively mild temperature of the room. Watson studied the man carefully as they entered. Simpson appeared to be in his mid-30s, with thinning dark hair, narrow shoulders, and a nervous energy that made him seem both older and weaker than his actual years. His clothes, though made of good material, were rumpled and stained with mud from rest on the moor. There was the look of a man scheming, but Holmes stood just inside the doorway, taking in every detail of Simpson's appearance with that quiet, calculating gaze that seemed to strip away a man's defenses layer by layer. For several long moments, Holmes said nothing. He watched the suspect with a stillness that was almost unsettling. Simpson fidgeted under the weight of that silent scrutiny, shifting his position and clearing his throat nervously. Finally, Holmes stepped forward, his voice low and controlled, yet with an unmistakable note of authority. "Mr. Simpson, I will not waste time with small talk. The circumstances under which you were found place you under serious suspicion. But before drawing any conclusions, I require certain clarifications." Simpson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with, I've already spoken to the inspector. I've told him everything I know." Holmes tilted his head slightly, a gesture Watson had come to associate with mild amusement. "And yet, I suspect there are things you did not tell him. Let us begin with your reason for being on the property that night." Simpson shifted again, wringing his hands together. "I was walking. I left Tavistock late in the evening. I admit, I lost my way. The fog came in faster than I expected." Holmes's gaze remained fixed and unwavering. "And the opium-laced meat? Was that also for your evening stroll?" Simpson flinched as though struck. I won't deny that I had it with me, but I swear it was never meant for the trainer or for any person." it was for the horse. Inspector Gregory, standing in the corner, let out an exasperated sigh. "You see, Holmes? The man admits it freely. He intended to drug the horse." Holmes raised a hand, signaling the inspector to remain silent. "Let us be precise, Mr. Simpson's eyes darted between Holmes and the inspector, then settled on the... "It's no secret I've lost a good deal of money betting against Silverblaze. I thought, if the horse were under the weather on race day, the odds would shift. I never meant for any of this to happen. I swear it." Holmes took a slow, deliberate step closer. "You intended to feed the horse drugged meat, to incapacitate him, perhaps make him sluggish on race day. You assumed the stables would be poorly guarded that night?" Simpson nodded, shame creeping into his face. "I waited until the lights in the house went out. I crept close to the paddock, but I never reached the horse. Something startled me in the dark. I heard voices, footsteps. I panicked and fled into the moor." Watson noted the tremor in Simpson's voice, the sweat beating at his temple. Whether the man was lying or telling a half-truth, the stress of the situation had clearly pushed him to the edge of control. Holmes turned to Inspector Gregory. "When he was apprehended, was he found anywhere near the body?" "No," the inspector "He was picked up a good distance, wandering along the road toward Tap. His footprints didn't match those found at the crime scene." Holmes nodded slowly, as though filing that information away for future use. Watson, ever practical, asked the question that had been lingering at the back of his mind. "Holmes, do you believe him?" Holmes gave no direct answer. Instead, he paced slowly along the length of the room, pausing near the window, where the faint light struggled through the grime of the glass. He studied the damp patterns on the stone floor as though they contained a hidden message. "What interests me," Holmes said at last, "is not what Mr. Simpson has confessed to, but rather what he has failed to explain." Watson no further. Instead, he turned back to Simpson, his expression softening. "For now, Mr. Simpson, you will remain in custody, but rest assured, I shall not allow any man to be punished for a crime he did not commit." With that, Holmes signaled for the door to be unlocked, and the group stepped back out into the cold air of the moor. As they walked away from the holding room, Watson noticed the thoughtful frown on Holmes's face, the distant look in his eyes. He had seen it many times before. Holmes was beginning to assemble the puzzle, drawing connections that others could not yet. The mist thickened around them as they made their way back toward the stables. Somewhere in the fog, the truth waited, buried beneath layers of assumption and misdirection. And Holmes, as always, was closing in. The midday light on Dartmoor was dim, filtered through a low, unbroken ceiling of thick gray clouds that stretched as far as the eye could see. The wind moved in restless gusts across the moor, stirring the tall grasses and carrying with it the damp chill of distant. It was the kind of day when sound seemed to carry further than usual, where every footstep on gravel or soft earth felt somehow amplified in the surrounding stillness. Holmes, Watson, and Inspector Gregory made their way on foot from the main house back toward the King's Pyland stables. The group moved steadily, their boots leaving deep impressions in the wet ground, the air dense with moisture and the distant smell of peat from the bogland. Holmes walked ahead of the others, his coat billowing slightly with each step, his gaze fixed on the path in front of him, yet constantly shifting to absorb every detail of the landscape. Watson knew better than to disturb him in these moments. The detective's senses seemed heightened, as though he was not merely observing, but listening to the landscape itself. Listening for inconsistencies, for forgotten traces, for the silent language left behind by events already past. When they arrived at the stable yard, Holmes paused at the entrance, surveying the entire scene from a distance. The yard was quiet now, deserted except for a single stable boy moving hay from one stall to another with slow, distracted motion. Holmes stood there, still and watchful, as if allowing the place to speak before crossing the threshold. He moved first toward the main gate that led into the stable area. The ground here was a patchwork of hardened dirt, scattered straw, and countless hoofprints overlapping one another. Holmes dropped to one knee, running his fingers lightly across the surface, feeling the texture, the dampness, and noting the different patterns of pressure where horses had stood and moved. Without speaking, he rose and stepped toward the latch on Silver Blaze. It was an ordinary sliding bolt, showing no signs of damage or forced entry. Holmes examined the metal carefully, running a fingernail along its edge, checking for scratches, foreign fibers, or any fresh marks that might suggest tampering. He crouched low to inspect the hinges, the lower boards, and even the gaps between the floorboards inside the stall. Watson stood just behind him, observing the methodical nature of the examination. Every movement Holmes made was purposeful, each gesture informed by countless previous where overlooked details had often unlocked the heart of a mystery. Holmes then stepped inside the stall itself. The bedding had been disturbed, but not recent. Patches of flattened straw marked where the horse had once stood, and a few dark stains hinted at water or spillage from feeding. Holmes leaned in close to the wooden walls, examining the ground for traces of fiber or even a smear of earth that should not have been there. Turning next to the tack room, Holmes moved quickly through its contents. Saddles hung neatly on their racks, bridles looped carefully along the hooks, and grooming tools sat arranged on a low bench. He picked up each item in turn, examining the worn edges of leather, the slight indentation, metal buckles, and the presence of any residues or unfamiliar substances. He paused longest over a small, nearly empty sack of feed tucked into the corner. Withdrawing a pinch of the grain between his fingers, Holmes brought it to his nose, inhaling with the focus of a man tasting the air before a storm. Then, with deliberate care, he examined the water buckets for signs of tampering. No discoloration, no unusual scent. Next, Holmes stepped outside again, making his way along the narrow path that led from the stable yard toward the open moor. The ground here was softer, and despite the passage of several days and the recent rains, faint impressions remained. Holmes crouched over one particular area, examining a double set of footprints, one deeper, heavier set, belonging to a man in work boots, the other lighter and more scattered. Watson approached carefully, speaking just above a whisper. "Do you think these are Straker's footprints?" Holmes nodded, though he did not look. "And the lighter ones?" Holmes allowed himself perhaps the footsteps of our misguided suspect, Mr. Simpson, though their presence this far from the stable tells a slightly different story than the one he offered. Rising slowly, Holmes continued along the path, his eyes scanning the horizon. The fog that morning had lifted slightly, revealing more of the landscape, the low ridges, the patches of gorse, and the distant fence line marking the outer perimeter of the estate. At one point, Holmes paused beside a gate leading out onto the open moor. The latch here showed faint traces of rust, but there was something else, a small smear of dark, greasy residue along the edge of the wood. Holmes reached into his pocket, producing a clean handkerchief, and carefully collected the sample. Without a word, he folded the cloth and tucked it away. As they returned to the stable yard, Holmes requested that all the stable workers be gathered for brief questioning. The men arrived, standing in a loose semicircle, shifting uneasily under Holmes's scrutiny. Holmes's questions came quickly and quietly. What each man had done on the night of the disappearance, who had last seen Silver Blaze in his stall, and whether anyone had noticed strangers near the property before the event. Though their answers varied in detail, a pattern began to emerge, one of routine, familiarity, and small but significant gaps in memory. One worker admitted to stepping away from the stables for several minutes that night, to smoke a pipe near the edge of the property. Another recalled hearing what he thought was a soft thud outside, but had dismissed it as the shifting of a restless. Holmes took each answer in stride, his face revealing nothing, but Watson, observing closely, could sense the web tightening inside his friend's mind. Finally, Holmes requested to see the items recovered from Simpson: the walking stick, the packet of drugged meat, and the small notebook filled with scribbled betting odds and race schedules. With these in hand, Holmes stood for several moments in the center of the stable yard, turning each object over carefully, holding them to the light, weighing them in his palm as though their physical presence might speak more honestly than the men who had held them. Without looking up, Holmes spoke, his voice steady and low. The solution to this puzzle does not lie in the obvious. It lies in the overlooked, in the assumptions we have accepted without question. Watson knew this tone well. It signaled that Holmes's mind was already steps ahead, charting connections and possibilities yet unseen by the others. As the group began to disperse, Holmes remained where he stood, his eyes narrowing, scanning the surrounding fields, the horizon, and the endless stretch of Dartmoor beyond. The detective was hunting now, not for a missing horse, not for a killer, or the single hidden threat would unravel the late afternoon settled over Dartmoor with an eerie quiet. The air had grown colder, with the first traces of evening mist creeping slowly across the open fields. The distant sound of a shepherd's whistle drifted faintly from beyond the far ridge, followed by the soft clatter of sheep moving in the distance. But here, near the King's Pyland stables, there was only silence, punctuated by the occasional restless snort from the few remaining horses left behind. Holmes stood near the gate leading from the stables toward the open moor, his gaze fixed thoughtfully on the ground. For several minutes he had remained motionless, arms folded, his eyes scanning the faint marks left in the soft earth, as though reading some invisible script written by passing feet. Watson observed from a short distance away, familiar with Holmes's ability to pull meaning from what others considered mere background noise. Yet even Watson, after years of friendship and observation, found himself puzzled by what exactly had caught his friend's attention at this particular moment. Finally, Holmes turned and motioned for Inspector Gregory to join him. "Inspector," Holmes said in that low, measured tone that often preceded some revelation, "there is a detail you mentioned earlier, something that struck me as both peculiar and important." Gregory approached, brushing the dampness from the sleeve of his overcoat. "You are referring to the stable dog, I presume?" "Indeed." Holmes allowed a pause to settle between them, giving weight to the observation. Who reported that on the night of the disappearance, the dog, whose duty it was to guard this area, remained silent. No barking, no signs of distress or alarm. Is that correct? Gregory nodded. That is correct. The stable hands confirmed it as well. The dog was perfectly quiet all night. Holmes tilted his head, allowing the statement to linger in the air like a riddle. And that, Inspector, is precisely the curious incident. Watson stepped closer, sensing the importance of Holmes's focus, but unsure of its full implication. Holmes continued, speaking with that slow clarity he reserved for moments of deeper deduction. "Let us consider the role of the dog, its instinct, its training, its environment. This animal knows every stable hand, every servant, every man who walks this yard with regularity. Its primary function is to guard against strangers, intruders, or any behavior it deems unusual." Watson nodded in agreement. Yet on the night in question, Holmes said, the dog remained silent. It did not bark. It did not whine. It gave no signal of alarm whatsoever. Inspector Gregory frowned. That may simply mean the cub was careful, perhaps moved with unusual stealth. Holmes shook his head slowly. No, It suggests something far more telling. The dog did not react because the person it observed was someone it knew, someone familiar, someone it would never consider a threat. A thin line of realization connecting the dots. You believe the individual who entered the stable that night was someone from within the household? Someone the dog would have recognized and trusted? Holmes allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, though it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Precisely. This single fact removes the likelihood of an outside intruder acting alone. Simpson's story, flawed as it is, becomes even less central to the real crime. If the dog did not react to him, then Simpson was never near enough to the stables to provoke a response. Watson glanced back toward the building, imagining the silent dog lying curled near the door, half asleep. As someone it trusted entered the stable, Holmes moved again, retracing the path from the stable door toward the moor, stopping at key points along the way, examining the gate latch, observing the worn path between the feed storage and the main road. His attention settled for a long moment near the small tool shed adjacent to the tack room, where old equipment, spare buckets, and unused fencing material had been stacked carelessly. Inside, Holmes examined the floor, the corners, the shelving. At one point he paused, crouching to pick up a small object from the dirt just inside the doorway. Holding it up to the fading light, he turned it between his fingers. A short fragment of cotton thread, white, with a faint, oily discoloration. Watson stood nearby. Another clue? Possibly. Holmes placed the thread carefully into a small envelope and slipped it into his coat pocket. By now the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the entire property into a cool, bluish twilight. Lamps began to flicker to life around the main house, their warm glow spreading out against the gloom. As they returned toward the colonel's residence, Holmes remained unusually quiet, walking with slow, deliberate steps, his hands clasped behind his back, his head slightly bowed. The mental machinery, Watson knew, was running at full speed, processing every observation, weighing every inconsistency, and constructing an increasingly detailed portrait of what had happened. Before re-entering the house, Holmes paused at the foot of the steps, turning once more to survey the yard, the stables, and the distant line of the moor beyond. Somewhere out there, between the trusting silence of a guard dog and the final resting place of John Straker, and Holmes, as always, was closing the distance between question and answer with every step. The next morning, Dartmoor awoke beneath a thin layer of blanketing the colorless that seemed to mute every. The grass glistened with moisture, and the air tasted sharp and cold, with the promise of rain lingering somewhere beyond the horizon. Sherlock Holmes rose early, well before breakfast was served at Colonel Ross's. By the time Watson joined him in the front hall, Holmes was already fastening the buttons of his long coat, his hat pulled low over his brow, his walking stick in hand. Without ceremony, Holmes set off toward the moor, moving with a purposeful stride. Watson and Inspector Gregory followed close behind, boots sinking slightly into the wet soil as they crossed the uneven terrain. The distant cry of a curlew echoed across the landscape, and now and then the ground squelched underfoot, where small pools of water had gathered from the night's dampness. Arriving at the precise location where John Straker's body had been found, Holmes paused for a long time at the perimeter, taking in the scene with eyes sharpened by years of observation. The area itself was a natural dip in the moor, a shallow depression flanked by tall grass and small clusters of heather. The earth here remained dark and soft, and even after days of trampling by search parties and constables, Holmes still managed to find untouched patches where the original imprints lingered faintly. Holmes crouched low, pulling out his magnifying lens with the casual fluidity of a man retrieving a with delicate movements. He began inspecting the ground around the spot where the Watson stood nearby, notebook in hand, prepared to record whatever observation might follow. Holmes's voice, when it came, was low and thoughtful. "Observe, Watson, the orientation of the body." Straker was found lying face down, with his head facing northwest. The wound to the skull was singular and fatal, located just behind the left ear, suggesting the blow came from behind and to the left. Holmes traced a small arc in the air with one hand, mimicking the trajectory. "And here? Notice the indentation." Holmes pointed to a depression slightly behind where the victim's head had been. It suggested the place where Straker's head had struck the ground at the moment of collapse. Moving a few steps further back, Holmes examined a partial footprint, one heel and a vague outline of a sole, the edges blurred by rain and time, yet still visible under close scrutiny. Noting the depth and angle of the print, Holmes murmured more to himself than to his companions. Heavy-set individual, but only one set of tracks distinct enough to measure, the rest overlapping, confused. He moved next to the spot where the small surgical knife had been discovered. The blade was still secured in an evidence envelope carried by Inspector Gregory, but Holmes studied the indentation in the earth where the handle had rested. It lay close to the victim's right hand, though not as if it had been dropped in struggle, but placed, or perhaps slipped from a pocket. Holmes gestured toward the surrounding ground. No signs of a struggle here, no scrapes in the dirt, no broken grass, no defensive wounds on the victim, apart from the fatal blow. Curious, Watson asked the question that had been building in his mind. Could the killer have approached unnoticed? In the dark? Perhaps catching Straker off guard? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he shifted his focus to its surrounding, examining inspecting the small stones that lined the edge of. At one point, Holmes stopped beside a small bent. He pulled a pair of tweed, extracted a single, nearly invisible strand, pale in color, clinging to the brittle stems of the plant. He held it up for wool, of a very delicate texture, and cut cleanly. From a garment, no doubt. Holmes folded the fiber carefully into a fresh envelope. The group continued moving outward in a slow, spiraling search pattern, covering the surrounding area with measured steps. Holmes remained methodical, checking the fence lines, the shallow ditches for overlooked objects, and even the underside of low-lying bushes where small items might have fallen unnoticed. He paused at one point near a large flat stone embedded in the earth, several yards. Kneeling beside it, Holmes pressed his hand lightly against its surface. Cold, rough, and flecked with bits of moss, the stone revealed little until Holmes noticed the faintest smear of something dark along one blood. It was barely visible, nearly washed away by rain and dew, but unmistakable to Holmes's trained eye. Interesting. Holmes rose, dusting off his hands, and finally, "There is the matter of the clothing." At Holmes's request, Inspector Gregory had arranged for Straker's garments to be preserved as found. Spread out carefully on a clean surface back at the house, the clothing had revealed its own share of peculiarities. Holmes asked that the inspector retrieve the items. Minutes later, back at the colonel's house, the group stood over the carefully laid out clothing. Straker's coat, waistcoat, trousers, and undergarments, each marked with notes from the police constables who had first examined them. Holmes lifted the coat first. It was not the kind of garment one would wear to bed. Instead, it was a full day's attire, boots polished, trousers creased, even the waistcoat buttoned with care. There was no nightshirt, no slippers, nothing to suggest that Straker had left his home in a hurry or in the middle of the night. Holmes ran his fingers along the inner lining of the coat, checking for foreign materials. He inspected the pockets, turning them inside. The contents were few: a penknife, a small leather notebook, and a single scrap of paper bearing a series of numbers that Holmes immediately recognized as racing odds. After a moment, Holmes stepped back and turned to face both Watson and Inspector Gregory. Straker, dressed fully, left his home with purpose, carried a delicate knife, and somehow met his death on the moor, alone, without apparent struggle. Holmes paused, letting the weight of the contradiction sink in. Gentlemen, this is no simple case of assault or chance encounter. This man went out that night with clear intentions. What those intentions were, I cannot yet say with certainty. But we are no longer merely investigating a theft. We are unraveling a carefully concealed plan, one that went tragically wrong. With that, Holmes gathered his coat and hat once more. Our next step is to uncover what it was that John Straker hoped to accomplish on that dark stretch of moor, why he never returned. The following afternoon, the atmosphere at King's Pyland had shifted in a subtle but undeniable way. The staff moved about their duties with lowered voices and uneasy glances toward one another. The horses stood restless in their stalls, reacting to the tension that lingered in the air like a scent that could not be washed away. Even the stable dog, normally attentive and alert, lay curled near the gate with its head resting on its paws, as though dulled by the growing uncertainty surrounding the estate. Holmes spent the morning in quiet wandering between the main house and the outbuildings with the slow, deliberate gait of a man piecing together a mental map invisible to all others. Watson, as always, followed close behind, notebook in hand, capturing each new question Holmes posed and each faint answer the landscape seemed to whisper. It was not until just before midday that Holmes requested an interview with Mrs. Straker. The widow had remained largely secluded in her chambers since the night of her husband's death, receiving visitors only when absolutely necessary and speaking as little as possible to the investigating officer. The sitting room where she waited had the heavy stillness of a place where grief, confusion had taken. The curtains remained half-drawn, filtering the pale light into thin bands that cut across the worn carpet. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, perhaps an effort to soften the heaviness of the atmosphere. When Holmes entered, Mrs. Straker sat near the fireplace, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her features, though worn with sorrow, retained a delicate sharpness, high cheekbones, a narrow chin, and dark eyes that seemed both distant and guarded. She wore a simple black dress, the lace collar slightly askew as though hastily fastened. Holmes offered her a courteous bow, but wasted no time with false condolences. "Madam, I understand this is a difficult time for you, but I must ask for your assistance in clarifying certain matters. Your cooperation may prove vital." Mrs. Straker nodded faintly, her voice soft but steady when she spoke. "I will do what I can, Mr. Holmes." Holmes began with questions about her husband's recent behavior, his mood, his schedule, any unusual habits she might have noticed in the days leading up to the incident. For several minutes, her answers remained predictable. John had been under stress, but that was to be expected with the Wessex Cup. He had spoken of concerns regarding the horse's training, but never in great detail. There had been no late-night arguments, no unexplained absences, at least none that she had been aware of. Holmes listened carefully, occasionally making small notes in his pocketbook. His questions grew more pointed, touching on John Straker's finances, his circle of acquaintances, and any correspondence that might shed light on his state of mind. It was when Holmes inquired about recent purchases that Mrs. Straker's composure faltered for the first time. "Has your husband, to your knowledge, made any unusual purchases in the past month?" Holmes asked, his tone carefully. Mrs. Straker hesitated. Her fingers tightened visibly around the handkerchief she held. There was something odd. A bill arrived last week from a London milliner. It was addressed to John, but the item listed was a dress pattern. A lady's dress pattern, ordered under his name, but I never saw such a... Watson, who had been standing discreetly near the door, exchanged a brief glance with Holmes. "And where was it delivered?" Holmes asked. "To an address I do not recognize. Somewhere in London. Holborn, I believe." Holmes closed his notebook with a slow, deliberate snap. "Thank you, madam. That will be all for now." As they stepped back into the corridor, Watson spoke in a low voice. "A woman in London? Surely not." Holmes shook his head. "It is far too early for assumptions, but this dress pattern suggests that our Mr. Straker may have been living a life somewhat larger than the one visible within these walls." Leaving the house behind, Holmes crossed the yard and made his way back toward the tap, pausing once again near the small tool. There he retrieved from his coat the delicate cotton fiber he collected earlier from the... Holding it side by side with a sample of the cloth used in typical women's dressmaking, Holmes noted the match. Not exact, but close enough to warrant suspicion. For the next several hours, Holmes moved from one member of the household staff to another, asking quiet, precise questions. Had anyone noticed their employer receiving private cars? Were there any unexpected visitors in recent weeks? Any unusual errands or unexplained absence? Though no single answer was decisive, a pattern began to emerge, fragments of observations that, when collected together, painted a portrait far more complicated than the outward life of a simple horse trainer. A stable hand recalled seeing Straker walking alone on the moor late one evening the week before his death, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. A kitchen maid mentioned that Mr. Straker had recently been seen counting a large sum of money in his study, though he had made no mention of any significant payments or debts to the household accounts. And then there was the matter of the small surgical knife. Holmes had already requested information from London suppliers regarding its purchase. By late afternoon, Holmes stood again at the edge of the moor, his coat collar turned up against the rising wind. Watson approached him there, observing the distant look on his friend's face. "It seems, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "that our Mr. Straker had secrets and perhaps more debts, emotional or financial, than his public life would suggest." Watson waited for more, but Holmes merely stood there, eyes fixed on the horizon, as though watching the full picture of Straker's double life unfold before him in the shifting patterns of the mist rolling over Dartmoor. The following morning dawned with a brittle, cold light that struggled to break through the heavy cloud cover resting over Dartmoor. The landscape remained soaked from the night's rainfall, leaving the ground spongy and dark, the air dense with moisture that clung to every surface. Yet despite the damp chill, Holmes was already out walking by first light, striding purposefully across the moor with Watson. Their objective that morning was clear: to follow, or at least reconstruct, the likely movements of Silver Blaze on the night of his disappearance. It was, after all, one of the central riddles of how could a horse of such size and power simply vanish without leaving a single clear track across the wide open moor? Holmes moved with steady determination, stopping frequently to crouch low and examine the ground. The wetness of the soil made even the faintest impressions more visible, though days of rain and foot traffic had blurred many of the original marks left near the stables. Still, Holmes seemed undeterred. At the edge of the stable yard, he paused for several minutes, his eyes scanning the patches of trampled earth where the search parties had gathered days earlier. He moved beyond that point, following a faint depression in the grass, leading toward the out. Holmes knelt beside, inspecting it closely with his magnifying. Watson watched silently as Holmes examined a small area where the grass had been pressed down. The marks were irregular, shallow, but Holmes measured them carefully with the help of a small folding rule he kept in his coat pocket. "Notice the width here, Watson. and the distance between the impressions. This was the passage of a large animal, but not at full gallop, being led at a controlled pace. From there, Holmes followed the faint line further onto the moor. The path grew less distinct with every year, the moist earth blending with natural animal tracks and the crisscrossing footprints of the dozens of men who had scoured the area immediately after the horses. At one point, they came upon softer ground, where Holmes stopped and stood surveying the area with a narrowed gaze. "Observe, Watson, the faint outline of horseshoe. The soil was softer here during the night, retaining more of the impression before the rain began." Watson crouched beside him, tracing the curve of the shallow print with his finger. Holmes continued along this invisible path, moving with what seemed like instinct. As they pushed further onto the moor, the land began to rise gently, sloping upward toward a series of low hills that provided a limited view of the surrounding area. From this vantage point, Holmes turned slowly in a full circle, studying the distant lines of the landscape. To the west, barely visible through the mist, stood a cluster of trees marking the boundary of the Mapleton stables, home to Silas Brown, a name that had surfaced more than once in the whispered conversations among the stable-hand local residents. Holmes stood there for a long time, facing the direction of Mapleton, his thoughts clearly focused but unspoken. The absence of further tracks became, in Holmes's eyes, its own kind of evidence. The lack of gallop marks, the absence of broken fences or crushed undergrowth, all pointed to a controlled movement rather than a panicked flight. Watson, feeling the need to voice the obvious, finally spoke. "Holmes, it seems impossible that a horse could have crossed this distance without leaving clearer tracks, unless the horse never left the moor." Holmes's voice was quiet but steady. They continued their search, expanding the radius outward. Holmes directed their steps toward a narrow strip of land where a shallow stream cut through the moor, its banks muddy and freshly disturbed. Holmes examined both sides of the water's edge, noting small indentations where hooves had pressed briefly into the soft soil. But here again, the trail ended abruptly. Holmes crouched near the stream, scooping a small amount of earth into his hand. He rubbed it between his fingers, testing the density, letting it fall slowly back to the ground. The rain had done its part to erase much of the evidence. Holmes straightened, glancing toward Watson. A horse as valuable as Silver Blaze would not have been allowed to wander far, not by anyone with sense or intention. The two men stood in silence, gazing across the open field toward the cluster of distant buildings that marked Mapleton. It was then that Holmes spoke again, this time with quiet. "I believe, Watson, that it is time we paid a visit to Mr. Silas Brown." The statement carried with it the weight of decision. Holmes's tone left no room for... Watson understood immediately that they were entering the next phase of the investigation, one that would bring them face to face with a man whose reputation for dishonesty and ruthlessness was known across every racing stable in the region. With the wind picking up and the first drops of new rain beginning to fall, Holmes turned toward the distant road leading west, his steps firm, his mind already calculating the conversation that would soon unfold. By early afternoon, the mist over Dartmoor had thickened again, curling low around the hedgerows and rising in ghost-like tendrils from the ground. The air felt heavier now, charged with the dense humidity of impending rain. The distant outlines of the Mapleton stables appeared as dark, low-slung shapes on the horizon, partially obscured by the shifting fog. Holmes walked with purposeful speed, the soles of his boots making soft, wet impressions in the dirt path, leading away from King's Pyland. Watson kept close, adjusting the collar of his coat against the damp wind. Neither man spoke during the long walk. Watson could sense that Holmes was arranging his thoughts in that precise, orderly fashion that often preceded his most significant discoveries. As they approached Mapleton, Holmes paused just beyond the main gate, surveying the yard with cool, calculated attention. The stables themselves were modest compared to the well-kept buildings at King's Pyland. The paint on the wooden beams had long since peeled away, and the fencing that bordered the paddocks leaned slightly at odd angles. Two grooms moved slowly across, leading horses toward the shelter of the barns. Their postures and glances betrayed something more than simple fatigue. There was a tension in their movement, a hurried, self-conscious air, as though they feared being watched. A man stood at the far end of the yard near the feed storage building, barking short, sharp orders to the workers. Stocky, broad-shouldered, and with a thick neck that disappeared into the collar of his overcoat, Silas Brown had the unmistakable look of someone accustomed to command and to conflict. His weathered face was framed by short graying hair, and his eyes, small, dark, and restless, scanned the yard with a suspicious glare. Holmes did not hesitate. Without waiting for an invitation, he pushed open the gate and strode directly toward the man. Silas Brown turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, his scowl deepening when he recognized Holmes. "You are Mr. Silas Brown," Holmes stated, stopping a few feet away. "That's right," the man answered, his tone defensive and impatient. "And you are trespassing on my property. State your business." Holmes ignored the husk. His voice remained steady, almost conversational, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of authority. "I believe you are aware of the events at King's Pyland over the past few days. A valuable racehorse has gone missing, and a man has been found dead. I am here to inquire about both matters." Brown crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "And what makes you think I have it to do with it?" Holmes stepped closer, closing the distance between them to little more than "Because, Mr. Brown, the trail of evidence leads quite clearly, and because I'm certain that Silver Blaze is, at this very moment, somewhere within your custody, though perhaps not appearing exactly as he once did." Brown's face flushed with sudden color, but he recovered quickly, forcing a bitter laugh. "You're mad. I've got nothing to hide. Search the place if you won't find your horse here." Holmes did not move. His gaze remained locked on Brown, unwavering. "Let us not waste each other's time," Holmes said quietly. "You and I both know that such a search would be inconvenient for you. Your reputation would suffer. Your future within the racing community would be irreparably damaged." Brown opened his mouth to respond, but Holmes cut him off, lowering his voice further. "However, I offer you a choice. Return the horse to King's Pyland before nightfall. Do it quietly. No names will be mentioned. No official statements will be made. If you refuse, I shall begin a formal search with the full cooperation of Scotland Yard, and I will make it very clear that you obstructed the investigation of both a theft and a possible murder." For several long seconds, Brown remained frozen, staring at Holmes with a mixture of anger and calculation. Watson, standing just behind, could see the battle playing out behind the man's small, darting eye. It was a familiar type of fear not of justice, but of exposure. Finally, Brown exhaled sharply, as though releasing air from a bellows. His shoulders sagged slightly, and the fight in him seemed to loosen. You will keep my name out of it," he muttered. Holmes gave a single nod. "Provided that Silver Blazes returned unharmed and without delay." Brown wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, glancing nervously toward the barn at the far end of the property. "He's here," Brown admitted in a low voice, "in the lower stall, covered with a dark coat, and I had the white markings altered. Just temporary dye, I swear it." Holmes showed no reaction to the confession. Instead, he simply turned to Watson. "Come, Watson, our business here is concluded." Without waiting for further words, Holmes began walking back toward the road, leaving Silas Brown standing alone in the muddy yard, shoulders hunched, staring after them with a pale and shaken expression. As they made their way back toward King's Pyland, Watson broke the silence. "Holmes, how did you know?" There were no direct tracks leading here, no proof. Holmes smiled faintly, but his eyes remained focused ahead. Sometimes, when the footprints disappear, one must look not at where the subject went, but where it would be easiest for him to hide. Watson nodded slowly, absorbing the simplicity and elegance of the deduction. "And what now? What now?" Holmes replied, glancing briefly toward the darkening sky. "Now we wait for the horse to come home." And with that they walked on, the mist curling around their figures like a closing curtain as the first drops of evening rain began to fall. The following hours passed with a slow, weighty stillness, as though the entire landscape of Dartmoor had paused in quiet anticipation. Back at King's Pyland, the household carried on with nervous routine. The stable lads busied themselves with chores they had done countless times before, yet their glances toward the moor grew more frequent. Colonel Ross remained confined to a study, pacing into rotation, glancing at the clock on the mantel every few minutes, as if willing the hands to. Holmes, however, was calm. He had returned from Mapleton without any visible sign of urgency, as though the matter were already settled. After taking a light meal with Watson, he seated himself near the fireplace in the drawing-room, stretching out with a thin book in hand, though Watson noticed that he scarcely turned a single page. By late afternoon, the light outside began to fade, and a cold wind picked up across the moor, rattling the window panes and sending loose leaves skittering across the stone walkway. Holmes rose from his chair with measured slowness and moved to the front window, standing there in silence as he gazed out toward the northern road. Watson approached from behind, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "You're certain Brown will comply?" Watson asked, keeping his voice low. Holmes's eyes did not leave the distant. "I have no doubt, Watson. Silas Brown is a man ruled by fear, not the fear of conscience, but the fear of consequence." Watson, "You relied entirely on intimidation?" Holmes turned slightly, allowing a rare smile to flicker across his. "No, Watson, I told him precisely what would happen if he failed to act. I left no room for misunderstanding, and most importantly, I allowed him to believe he still had a choice." As if to prove Holmes correct, the sound of approaching hooves soon drifted up from the lane beyond the house. The rhythmic beat grew louder with each passing second, and moments later, a figure on horseback appeared through the thinning fog, guiding a second horse closely behind on a lead. Watson stepped quickly to the front door and opened it wide. There he was, Silver Blaze, though partially obscured by the old dark blanket that had been draped across his back. The horse's unmistakable build and powerful frame were visible even beneath the crude disguise. The horse's head, normally so striking with its distinct white blaze, now appeared dulled and altered, as though someone had taken deliberate care to stain the markings with a dark, muddy dye. Colonel Ross rushed from his study at the sound of hooves, nearly colliding with Watson in the hallway. When he saw the animal standing there in the fading daylight, his face shifted rapidly from disbelief to overwhelming relief. "It's him. It's really him." The colonel stepped forward, laying both hands gently against the horse's neck, as though afraid that the vision before him might disappear at any moment. Silver Blaze remained calm, his breath steady, his great dark eyes watchful but free of panic. Whatever ordeal he had endured, he showed no outward signs of harm. Holmes stood back, watching the reunion with quiet satisfaction. Watson moved closer, examining the horse's legs and joints with a practiced eye. No visible injuries, no swelling. The animal appeared strong and well-fed. Only the poor attempt at concealing his identity marred his appearance. Holmes approached the horse next, running a gloved hand along the stained fur of the Blaze. The touch was light, clinical, water-soluble dye, crude application, done in haste. It will wash out within the week. Colonel Ross turned to Holmes, his voice trembling slightly. How How on earth did you know he was there? Holmes's expression remained calm. By eliminating the impossible and focusing on what remained, Brown had the motive, the proximity, the means to conceal the horse quickly and without. The condition of the ground made transportation by road unlikely. The most logical was the nearest rival stable. Colonel Ross nodded slowly, clearly struggling to process the simplicity of the answer in contrast with the complexity of the situation. Holmes gestured toward the horse's legs. You will want to examine him thoroughly, Colonel, but I am confident you will find no injury, no lasting damage. Silver Blaze will run, and run well. The colonel's eyes brightened at that thought. And as for Brown? Holmes's tone turned cool, almost dismissive. We shall let him stew in his fear for a while longer. There is more yet to uncover. And until then, discretion will serve us better than confrontation. As the stable hands led Silver Blaze back toward his familiar stall, the mood across King's Pyland shifted like a sudden change in weather. Conversations became louder, movement quicker, faces less drawn with worry. The return of the horse, it seemed, had broken the spell of dread that had held the estate in its grip. Yet for Holmes, Watson knew, the real work was just beginning. The mystery of Silver Blaze's disappearance had been resolved, but the death of John Straker, that darker question, still hung heavily in the air. And Holmes, standing quietly near the front steps, staring once again toward the moor, showed every sign that his mind was already deep in pursuit of the answer. The following morning arrived with a clarity Dartmoor had not seen for days. The fog had lifted, revealing the vast rolling hills in sharp relief under a pale blue sky. The grass, still wet with dew, shimmered faintly under the growing light. Yet, despite the improved weather, a new tension lingered in the air, quieter but no less real. Silver Blaze was home, yes, but the strange condition of the horse's appearance now demanded attention. Holmes rose before dawn, as was his habit when in the final phases of Watson found him already standing in the stable yard, observing the grooms as they carefully began the process of cleaning and grooming Silver Blaze after his unexpected return. The dark stain that had been applied to the horse's signature white blaze was already beginning to fade in places where the men had worked at it with brushes and water. Thin streaks of white emerged from beneath the discoloration, like patches of light cutting through a cloud. The stable lads worked cautiously, still half afraid of making a mistake, but Colonel Ross had given strict instructions: restore the horse's appearance as quickly and safely as possible. Watson stood nearby, watching the process unfold. Holmes, hands folded behind his back, observed in silence for several minutes. His gaze moved slowly from the horse's forelock to the bridge of its nose, then down to the front legs and hooves, studying the creature with the same level of scrutiny he would have given a crime scene. At one point, Holmes stepped forward and motioned for the head groom to halt. "May I?" asked quietly. Without waiting for an answer, Holmes lifted a damp cloth from the water bucket and began wiping along the length of the horse's face. As he did, the dark dye began to lift more clearly. With each gentle pass of the cloth, the original white marking revealed itself in sharp contrast. Holmes worked with slow, deliberate care, ensuring that Watson, Colonel Ross, and even Inspector Gregory, who had arrived moments earlier, could witness the transformation firsthand. The deception, Holmes said after was crude, but effective enough for its intended purpose, a hasty application, likely done with common shoe polish or a similar substance, something readily available in a stable. Colonel Ross stood nearby, shaking his head in disbelief. To think, my own horse, hidden in plain sight, altered like a cheap counterfeit. Holmes gave a small nod. That was the design. Disguise the appearance, hide the blaze, changed just enough to avoid suspicion from anyone casually observing. The goal was not to make him vanish forever, only long enough for the Wessex Cup to pass, and for certain individuals to profit from his absence. Inspector Gregory, shifting uneasily on his feet, cleared his throat. "You're suggesting, then, that Silas Brown intended to keep the horse only temporarily?" Holmes turned to face the inspector fully. Without doubt, Brown would have waited until after the race, then quietly returned the animal or sold it under false pretenses. Either way, escape with profit, while Colonel Ross faced the public humiliation of losing his most valuable. Watson, ever analytical, asked the question lingering in the minds of all present. "But Holmes, how was the horse transported here? There were no clear tracks across the moor, no wagons, nothing." Holmes offered a faint smile, his voice low but clear. "The absence of tracks was the most revealing clue of all. Silver Blaze was led here, not ridden, not driven, led slowly and carefully by someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain during the night, under cover of fog. The ground in places was firm enough to disguise hoof impressions, and where it was not, the few marks that existed were quickly obscured by the comings and goings of search parties in the following days." Holmes paused, casting a final glance toward the nearly restored blaze on the horses. Additionally, the application of the dye would have taken place shortly after the horse arrived at Mapleton. Time was against them. The faster they concealed his identity, the lower the risk of discovery. Colonel Ross, though visibly relieved to have his horse back, remained troubled by the deeper implications. And Brown, what of him? Surely he can't expect to walk away from this without consequence. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the horizon. Brown's cooperation has been useful for now. Let us not forget, the investigation is far from over. The matter of Mr. Straker's death remains unresolved. Until I have all the pieces, the time for formal accusations must wait. Watson sensed the deliberate choice in Holmes's words. There was more, much more, that Holmes had observed but had not yet revealed. As the morning stretched on, the grooms continued their work, rinsing away the last traces of disguise from Silver Blaze's coat. The horse stood calmly throughout, occasionally lifting his head, ears flicking at the distant sounds of the moor. For those gathered in the stable yard, the return of Silver Blaze marked the end of one mystery. But for Holmes, it was merely the closing of a smaller chapter within a much larger, far more troubling story. And as Watson followed Holmes back toward the house, he could not shake the growing sense that the darkest answers were still waiting, buried somewhere between the rolling hills of Dartmoor and the complex secret life of a man now lying cold beneath its. By early afternoon, the sun pushed weakly through the thinning clouds, casting muted rays across the Dartmoor landscape. The air remained cool and damp, but there was a certain restless energy at King's Pine. The stable yard bustled with quiet but focused activity as preparations began to ensure Silver Blaze's swift and discreet return to his rightful place in the Colonel's lineup for the Wessex Cup. Holmes, with his usual efficiency, had already arranged every detail. He understood that time was critical. Rumors traveled quickly in the racing, and any delay could risk exposing the delicate circumstances surrounding the horse's disappearance. Moreover, Holmes was keenly aware that public knowledge of Silver Blaze's time at Mapleton would cause scandal, not only for Colonel Ross, but also for the broader racing community. Watson found Holmes in the Colonel's private study, standing at the large oak writing desk, bent over a map of the region. Small pins marked key locations: King's Pyland, the site of Straker's death, the patch of moor where the trail had vanished, and Mapleton Stables. A new pin now marked a back lane known only to a few locals, an overgrown service road winding between the two properties. Holmes glanced up as Watson. The colonel has arranged for a trusted groom and 2 stable hands to collect the horse from Mapleton under cover of dusk. They will take the back lane, this path here, avoiding the main road entirely. Watson nodded, following the line Holmes traced across the map. Holmes continued. By the time the horse arrives, the staff here will have the stall freshly prepared. We will act as though Silver Blaze never left, and when the Wessex Cup arrives, he will run as planned. Colonel Ross appeared at the doorway, his expression tight but resolved. I must thank you, Holmes. Your unconventional methods seem to have produced results. Holmes allowed himself the briefest smile. The truth, Colonel, is rarely found within the bounds of convention. Ross shifted his gaze to Watson. I must admit, when you both arrived, I had little hope of seeing my horse again, much less in racing condition. Holmes folded the map carefully, placing it back into its drawer. We still have much to resolve. I need not remind you that a man lies, but for now, let us focus on securing Silver Blaze's safety. As evening approached, the air grew colder, and a thin mist began to curl low across the fields. Just after sunset, a small covered cart left Mapleton, moving cautiously along the back lane as instructed. 2 stable boys rode ahead on horseback, scouting the road for any sign of travelers. Behind them, beneath thick woolen blankets, and accompanied by one of Colonel Ross's most trusted grooms, Silver Blaze moved quietly, his powerful frame obedient to the familiar hands guiding him home. At King's Pyland, the stable was lit by a single oil lamp, its soft yellow glow illuminating the freshly laid straw in Silver Blaze's stall. The air inside carried the familiar blend of hay, leather, and earth, the smells of home. Holmes stood by the stall door as the groom led the horse inside. The return was done without ceremony, without loud voices or unnecessary witnesses. Only Colonel Ross, Watson, and a single stable hand watched as the horse was settled, his blanket removed, his feed bucket filled, and his flanks wiped down with slow, steady strokes. Watson observed Silver Blaze closely, noting the animal's steady breathing, the healthy shine returning to his coat now that the dye had been fully removed. The horse appeared unshaken, as though his days away from King's Pyland had been little more than an inconvenience. Colonel Ross lingered beside the stall, watching every movement with quiet intensity. Holmes placed a reassuring hand on the colonel's shoulder. Rest easy tonight, Colonel. Your horse is home, and soon the questions that remain will find their answers. Ross turned, offering Holmes a look of genuine gratitude. Thank you for this. Holmes nodded once, then stepped back from the stall, already retreating into the analytical silence that so often followed the successful resolution of one part of a case. Later that evening, after the stable lamps had been extinguished and most of the staff had retired to their quarters, Holmes and Watson sat alone near the fireplace in the guest parlor. Watson, unable to suppress his curiosity any longer, asked the question lingering at the forefront of his mind. Holmes, do you believe we've seen the last of Silas Brown in this matter? Holmes leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. For now, yes. Fear is an effective motivator, Watson. Brown will lie low, at least until the Wessex Cup has. But after that, who can say? Holmes's voice dropped lower, his tone shifting. But make no mistake, Watson, the true mystery, the reason Straker ventured onto the moor that night, still waits for us, and until I know why, I will not rest. Watson fell silent, understanding the weight of those words. The case, though appearing solved on the surface, remained unfinished, and for Holmes the work of deduction never truly paused until every shadow had been chased away. Outside, the wind shifted again, rattling the shutters against the stone walls. The night deepened, and the moor stretched endlessly beyond, dark, quiet, and holding its secrets tightly in its grasp. As the first gray light of dawn crept across the horizon, Holmes was already awake, standing at the edge of the moor, his coat buttoned high against the morning chill. The air was damp and sharp, each breath clouding faintly in front of his face. Behind him, King's Pyland remained quiet after the tense days they had endured. Yet Holmes's mind had the recovery of Silver Blaze was only one layer of the puzzle. The darker, more troubling question, the death of John Straker, still hung unanswered, like low fog refusing to lift. Watson joined him shortly after, pulling his scarf tighter as he crossed the dew-laden grass. "I suspected I might find you here, Holmes." Holmes didn't turn. His eyes remained fixed on the distant, where the moor dipped into the shallow depression where Straker's body had been found. This case, it contains too many contradictory pieces. Watson stood quietly at his side, allowing Holmes the space to think aloud. "The facts, as they stand, are insufficient," Holmes continued. "A trusted trainer, with no known enemies, is found dead on the moor. A surgical knife by his side, no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, and perhaps most curious of all, fully dressed, as though prepared for a task, yet leaving no note, no explanation." Holmes turned then, looking Watson in the eye. The human mind, Watson, resists chaos. It craves pattern, yet here, the pattern feels incomplete. They walked together toward the site once more. The earth still bore the faint scars of the search efforts and the passing of boots and hooves. Holmes stepped carefully between the muddied impressions, revisiting each point where he had crouched and observed before. Standing near the spot where Straker's body had been discovered, Holmes knelt and pressed his palm flat against the damp soil. The depth of this indentation, consistent with a sudden fall. The angle of the wound, from behind and to the left. But why here? Why at this particular point on the moor? Holmes rose slowly, brushing his gloves clean. "Let us reconstruct." Straker leaves his home under cover of darkness, fully dressed. He takes with him a small surgical knife, not a weapon for defense, but for precision work. He ventures far enough onto the moor to avoid immediate detection, and then he dies. Watson, his brow furrowed, offered a hesitant thought. Perhaps he was meeting someone, an accomplice, or perhaps an intended victim. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Perhaps. But then, where are the signs? No other set of matching footprints near the body apart from his own, and the constable's, of course. No signs of struggle, no defensive injuries. Holmes turned, scanning the surrounding ground. And then, there is the horse, Silver Blaze, missing on the same night. There are two disappearances, happening in parallel, not coincidence, surely. Holmes gestured toward the horizon. We know now that the horse was taken to Mapleton, but how did Straker's death connect to that fact? Did he discover the thief and pay for it with it, or was something else more deliberate? Holmes paused, his gaze sharp. There is another detail, the knife. Holmes pulled from his coat pocket the small, clear evidence envelope containing the surgical knife retrieved from the scene. He held it up for Watson to see. You'll notice. The blade is narrow, razor-sharp, and of a type used not for aggression, but for careful, deliberate incision. Watson leaned close. It would be suitable for veterinary or even tailoring, Holmes' sting observation. And now consider Straker's attire that night. Fully dressed. Street clothes, not nightwear, shoes polished, trousers pressed. Holmes paused again. Would a man rise from bed in the middle of the night, dress himself with such care, and walk out onto the moor carrying only a delicate knife, all by accident? Watson felt the weight of the question settle between them. The two men stood in silence for several moments, the morning wind moving softly through the grass around their feet. Holmes spoke again, his tone lower, almost more to himself than to Watson. A man leaves his home dressed for the day in the middle of the night. He carries a tool suited for delicate work. He goes to a secluded place, and within hours he is found struck down by a single fatal blow to the... Holmes's gaze turned distant, as though seeing something Watson could not. The question, Watson, is not merely who killed John Straker, but why Straker placed himself in a position to die. With that, Holmes turned back toward King's Pyland, his coat whipping lightly behind him in the breeze. Watson followed, already sensing that the next step in Holmes's investigation would be as much about uncovering Straker's intentions as it would be about exposing the hand that had delivered the fatal blow. And in Holmes's mind, the lines between victim and culprit were already beginning to blur. Late that afternoon, with the damp chill of Dartmoor beginning to settle in once more, Holmes returned to the small room where Straker's belongings had been carefully stored by the local. The items lay arranged on a large oak table near the rear of the colonel's house, each piece meticulously labeled and untouched since the initial investigation had begun. Watson joined him there, notebook in hand, prepared to record any new observations. Holmes stood over the table for several minutes without speaking, allowing his gaze to move slowly across the collection of evidence. Straker's coat, waistcoat, trousers, shirt, and boots had all been laid out with care. Nearby, in a small wooden box, rested the surgical knife, its thin, gleaming blade stark against the dark felt lining beneath it. Holmes began with the clothing. Lifting the coat by its collar, he held it up to the light, turning it slowly to examine the fabric. It was of good quality, though not extravagant, typical attire for a man in Straker's position. Holmes's fingers moved lightly over the seams, checking for hidden pockets, stray fibers, or foreign particles. Along the lower hem he paused, removing a faint, nearly invisible thread, pale, woolen, and delicate, distinctly out of place on such a garment. Holmes placed the thread carefully into an envelope without comment. Next, he examined the waistcoat and shirt. Both were clean, bearing no stains or tears. This fact struck Watson as odd, given the violent nature of Straker's death. One would expect some evidence of a struggle, or at the very least, the natural dishevelment that comes with sudden violence. Yet here the clothing remained immaculate, as though Straker had stepped onto the moor with precise intention, not in haste or panic. Holmes moved. Along the outer seam of the right leg, he detected something else, an irregularity in the stitching. Bending closer, he found a small area where the fabric had been recently resewn. The stitches were tighter, newer, and out of alignment with the original tailoring. Holmes turned to Watson. Note this, alteration, recent by an unskilled hand, judging by the unevenness. Watson nodded quickly, recording the observation. Then came the boots. Holmes turned each one over in his hands, inspecting the soles for wear pads, mud, and any foreign material might offer a clue. On the left sole, near the heel, Holmes found a small, hardened clump of dark material. He scraped it loose with the tip of a penknife and sniffed it briefly before sealing it in another envelope. Peat, from the far side of the moor. Unusual, given that Straker's body was found nowhere near that particular stretch. Holmes returned the boots to the table, then turned his full attention to the small surgical knife. He lifted it delicately between two fingers, holding it up against the fading afternoon light streaming through the window. A fine instrument, Holmes murmured, designed for control, not force. Its weight, balance, all suited for precision work. Watson stepped forward. You said before that this is no weapon for defense, but why would Straker carry such a tool onto the moor? Holmes's expression remained thoughtful. That, Watson, is precisely the question. that will bring this case to its turning point. Holmes lowered the knife, examining the blood. A faint residue lingered near the edge, a dark, sticky smear barely visible without the help of blood, but no other tissue. Curious. Holmes made note of the observation, then carefully set the knife back in its box. Moving next to the personal contents recovered from Straker's pockets, Holmes sifted through a small collection of items. A pocketbook containing a handful of racing notes and betting odds, a silver watch, and, most curiously, a small folded bill from a London milliner dated 2 weeks prior. Holmes unfolded the bill and read it aloud. One lady's dress pattern, silk material, special order. Addressed to John Straker, care of a Holborn address. Watson's brow furrowed. The same address Mrs. Straker mentioned. Indeed. Holmes folded the paper again and tucked it into his inner pocket for safekeeping. So, Watson, a man ventures onto the moor late at night carrying a surgeon's knife, dressed in full-day clothes, with a history of secret purchases for a woman unknown to his wife. He dies without apparent struggle, leaving behind little more than a scattering of peculiar threads and an unconvincing explanation. Watson set his notebook down, the weight of the inconsistencies pressing heavily in his mind. Holmes stepped away from the table, moving toward the window, where he stood gazing out at the growing dusk that settled over Dartmoor. I'm thinking, Watson, that John Straker had no intention of returning home that night in the same condition he left it. Watson remained silent, letting the words settle. Holmes turned at last, his expression shifting from contemplation to determination. There is something else we must investigate. Straker's connections in London, and the true purpose for which he carried that. With that, Holmes moved toward the door, gathering his coat and hat. We leave for Tavistock at first light. There is more to be uncovered, and I believe we are close to the heart of this mystery. The following morning arrived with the first clear sky Dartmoor had seen in over a week. Thin beams of sunlight reached across the fields, stretching long shadows over the wet ground. Yet, even as the weather lifted, the mood inside King's Pyland remained heavy with unanswered questions. Holmes was already dressed and ready by the time Watson joined him in the front hall. The detective stood by the door, overcoat buttoned, gloves in hand, hat perched low on his brow, looking every bit as focused as he had been on the day they arrived. Our destination today is Tavistock, said simply, as Watson pulled on his own coat. From there, we shall send a wire to London. There is a particular milliner whose accounting practices interest me very much. The small market town of Tavistock lay just a few miles from King's Pyland. The journey by hired carriage took less than an hour, but Holmes spent the entire ride lost in thought, his gaze distant, fingers steepled before him, as the miles slipped by outside the window. Upon arrival, they made their way first to the telegraph. Holmes composed a brief but direct message to a contact in London, requesting detailed information about a recent customer order placed at a certain millinery shop in Holborn. The request included specific dates and asked for names of any known recipients or repeat customers linked to the order. With that task complete, Holmes turned to Watson. While we wait for a reply, there is another matter we must attend to here in Tavistock. Watson followed as Holmes led the way to a modest tailor's shop on the edge of the town square. The storefront displayed a modest assortment of men's and women's garments, along with accessories and sewing materials stacked neatly behind the counter. Inside, the air smelled faintly of starch and cotton thread. An elderly tailor with a tape measure draped across his shoulders greeted them with a polite nod. "Good morning, gentlemen. How may I assist you?" Holmes smiled faintly, but wasted no time. "We are making inquiries regarding a particular type of fabric, pale wool, lightweight, commonly used in women's dress patterns. Have you supplied anything of the sort in recent weeks to a gentleman by the name of John Straker?" The tailor's face showed no immediate recognition. He paused, stroking his chin thoughtfully. Straker? The name sounds familiar. Let me check the order book. The man disappeared behind a curtain and returned moments later holding a worn ledger. Ah, yes. About 2 weeks ago, Mr. Straker ordered a small quantity of pale fine wool, along with a pattern for a lady's walking dress, special order, delivered to an address in Holborn. Holmes's expression sharpened. Was Mr. Straker a regular customer? The tailor shook. No, sir. First and only time I've had dealings with. Holmes nodded once. Thank you. That will be all. Leaving the shop, Holmes turned toward Watson as they stepped back onto a stable master with no known interest in tailoring, ordering fine ladies' fabric, and having it delivered not here, nor to his home, but to a London address, far from the eyes of his wife. Watson's curiosity deepened. Do you think he maintained a relationship there? Perhaps so. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he led Watson to a nearby cafe, where they could wait for a reply from London. Seated near the window with 2 cups of hot tea before them, Holmes spoke at last. I do not favor assumptions without proof, Watson, but it is clear that Straker had personal affairs well outside the knowledge of his household, affairs that involved discreet purchases, private addresses, and expenditures that his salary as a horse trainer would struggle to cover. As they waited, Holmes produced the small envelope containing the thread he had from Straker's coat. Holding it up to the light, he compared its texture and color against the sample fabric obtained from the tailor's. The match was close, not perfect, but close enough to a connection. Shortly before noon, the reply from London arrived at the telegraph office. Holmes read the message, then handed it to Watson. The response was brief but revealing. Order placed under the name John Straker. Delivery to Mrs. Lydia Marks, Holborn. Milliner confirms she is a known client. Repeat business over past several months. No known employment. Frequent purchases of similar patterns. Watson's eyes widened slightly as he lowered the telegram. A kept woman, then? Holmes's gaze remained distant. It would appear so. Watson leaned forward. But how does this connect to the night Straker died? Holmes's answer came slowly, almost as though he were speaking more to himself than to Watson. Financial strain, hidden debts, and secret arrangements in London. A man under pressure, seeking an opportunity. Watson, you believe Straker may have been involved in something more deliberate? Holmes offered a tight, unreadable smile. I believe, Watson, that the key to this case lies not just in what Straker was doing on the moor that night, but in what he intended to do and why he carried that knife. Holmes rose from his chair. Come, Watson, let us return to King's Pyland. There are still a few final threads to follow, and I have a suspicion that we are closer than ever to the full truth. As they stepped back into the cool afternoon air, Watson felt the unmistakable shift in Holmes's manner, the change that always signaled the approach of a final revelation. The game, as it often did in these cases, was drawing swiftly to its close. The late afternoon light angled low across the casting long uneven shadows that stretched over the damp fields surrounding King's Pyland. Inside the colonel's study, Holmes stood near the fireplace, arms folded tightly across his chest, his gaze fixed on a single point beyond the window where the land sloped away toward the distant. Watson sat nearby, notebook, watching his with quiet, and for the better part of an hour, Holmes had remained in this silent, reflective. His face was unreadable, his mind clearly at work. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute, the weight of approaching resolution building, like the slow, inevitable roll of distant thunder. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice low but steady. Watson, the facts, though scattered and at first contradictory, are beginning to settle into a coherent pattern. Watson leaned forward, ready to transcribe. Consider, Holmes continued, pacing slowly across the floor. We have a man, John Straker, whose personal and financial life, though outwardly respectable, contains hidden fractures. There is the London milliner's bill, the secret delivery of ladies' dress materials, the quiet relationship with a woman unknown to his wife, all indications of personal duplicity. Holmes paused, turning toward the table where the small surgical knife rested inside its evidence box. And then there is the choice of weapon, not a cudgel, not a blade meant for defense, but a delicate, precise instrument better suited for its presence in Straker's pocket that night was no accident. Watson frowned. You mean Straker brought the knife for specific purpose? Holmes nodded slowly. Precisely. And when you pair that fact with the location of his death, a secluded spot on the moor, far from casual observation, the intention becomes clearer. Watson set his notebook aside for him, but what would he intend to do out there with such a tool, and in the dead of night? Holmes moved to the center of the room, speaking with greater intensity now. Let us recall that Silver Blaze was missing same night. What motive could Straker have for leaving his home, fully dressed, armed with a surgical blade, and making his way toward the horse's last note? He turned to face Watson fully. I propose this, Watson. Straker intended to sabotage Silver Blaze. Watson's eyes widened. Sabotage? Yes. Holmes's voice gained momentum. Straker was under financial pressure. Secret debts, perhaps connected to gambling, perhaps related to his affair in London. Either way, he found himself in need of a large sum of money. And quickly. Holmes began pacing again. Imagine the opportunity. By disabling Silver Blaze before the race, Straker could affect the betting odds. With Silver Blaze unable to compete, any wagers placed on rival horses, possibly arranged through third parties to avoid suspicion, would pay out handsomely. Watson sat upright, understanding beginning to dawn. And the knife? Holmes picked it up from the evidence box, holding it between two fingers. The ideal tool for making a small, nearly invisible incision, perhaps to the horse's tendon or fetlock, an injury subtle enough to render the animal lame, but not so obvious that it would be immediately detected during morning inspections. He lowered the knife back into its place. Such injuries are, sadly, common in the world of racing sabotage. A practiced hand could cause damage that would escape casual observation until it was too late. Watson shook his head in disbelief. So you believe Straker took the horse out onto the moor, intending to wound him? That is the most logical interpretation applied. The darkness, the isolation, the absence of witnesses, all consistent with such a plan. Watson exhaled slowly, absorbing the gravity of the theory, but then went wrong. Holmes's expression grew even more focused. That, Watson, is the next piece to uncover. But let me ask you that. Consider the temperament of Silver Blaze, a powerful, spirited animal, intelligent, sensitive, suddenly led away from familiar ground in darkness by a man behaving unusually. Watson's eyes widened again. You're suggesting the horse resisted? Holmes nodded gravely. Horses may be loyal, but they are also creatures of instinct. If Silver Blaze sensed danger, especially with a man kneeling near his legs, wielding a sharp instrument, it is entirely plausible that the horse reacted violently. Holmes made a brief chopping motion with a sudden defensive kick, delivered with full force. Straker, caught off guard, struck at the side of the head, falling instantly. Watson rose from his seat, the entire narrative taking form in his mind, which would explain the single fatal injury and the lack of struggle. Exactly. Holmes moved back toward the window, his tone shifting. And afterward, Silver Blaze, frightened, disoriented, likely bolted into the night, wandering the moor until found and taken by Silas Brown. Watson's thoughts raced. So Simpson, the bookmaker, played no part in Straker's death? Holmes shook his head. No. Simpson's attempt to drug the horse was foolish, but unrelated to the fatal outcome. A criminal act, yes, but not a murderous one. Watson stepped forward. Holmes, if your theory is correct, it means the true cause of death was accidental. Straker, undone by his own scheme. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. Poetic, is it not? For a moment, both men stood in silence, the magnitude of the revelation settling between them. But Holmes, Watson asked cautiously, you said we were close, but not finished. Holmes nodded once more. There remained final details to confirm: the examination of Silver Blaze's legs, a deeper inquiry into Straker's financial record, and one last conversation with Colonel Ross. Holmes turned to gather his coat. Come, Watson. There is still work to be done before this case reaches its proper conclusion. And with that, they stepped out once more into the cold air of Dartmoor, the fading light catching Holmes's face as he led the way toward the next inevitable confrontation. The air inside Colonel Ross's study felt thick and still, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension of past days. The curtains remained half-drawn against the afternoon light, casting long, uneven shadows across the carpet and oak furniture. Holmes stood near the mantelpiece, staring silently at the embers in the fireplace as Watson entered, holding a folder of papers just delivered from the Colonel's accountant. Holmes had requested a full review of John Straker's recent financial transaction. The Colonel, though initially hesitant to release such personal information about his late trainer, had eventually relented under Holmes's quiet but unyielding insistence. Watson handed the folder over, and Holmes began reading with the same intensity he applied to every clue, every witness statement, every overlooked footprint. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the faint crackle of burning wood. Finally, Holmes lowered the papers onto the table, speaking in that low, precise tone that always signaled a conclusion forming. As I suspected, Watson, Straker's finances tell a story of desperation. Watson sat down, ready to listen. Over the past 3 months, Holmes continued, Straker had withdrawn large sums of money from his personal account, far more than his position and salary could justify. Small loans from local merchants, short-term credit from suppliers, even pawning personal items, including a gold pocket watch recorded in one of these receipts. Holmes tapped the paper lightly, and yet none of this was visible on the surface. His wife saw none of it. The household accounts remained balanced. His wages had been paid regularly. Watson frowned. Then where was the money going? His expression darkened. Partly, I believe, to the woman in London, Mrs. Lydia Marks. He retrieved the earlier telegram from the milliner, then produced the tailor's invoice from Tavistock. Multiple purchases, dress materials, accessories, repeated orders delivered directly to her address. A kept woman, maintained. And with that, the pressure on Straker's purse grew heavier. Watson nodded slowly, enough to drive a man toward desperate measures. Holmes stood and began pacing slowly across the room. We must consider human nature. Financial strain, when coupled with personal entanglements, creates a dangerous state of mind. A man like Straker, respected, trusted, yet living with concealed debt and deception, would see opportunity in the most unethical of places. Watson leaned forward. The Wessex Cup. Exactly. Holmes turned sharply. Silver Blaze was more than just a horse. He was a guaranteed prize, the safest bet in all of England. But if something happened to him before the race, if he were suddenly unable to compete, the entire balance of the betting market would shift overnight. Holmes crossed to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to watch the distant figures moving near the stables. And who better to orchestrate such an outcome than the man with unrestricted access to the horse. The man trusted above all others to protect him. Watson exhaled slowly, the realization settling deep. So Straker's plan was to injure Silver Blaze just enough to guarantee the horse's withdrawal, but not enough to ruin him permanently. Holmes nodded. Precisely. It had to appear as an accident, perhaps a sudden lameness, something no one would trace back to deliberate sabotage. Watson stood and moved toward the papers spread across the desk. And the betting. Holmes, do we have evidence that Straker placed wagers against Silver Blaze? That will be the final detail to confirm. I've sent word to 2 bookmakers in London, individuals who handle high-risk bets for clients unwilling to use their own names. If Straker used intermediaries, the pattern will emerge. He turned back to Watson. But in truth, even without that evidence, the weight of motive, means, and circumstance already points squarely at him. Watson asked the next question cautiously. Do you believe Straker acted alone? Holmes considered this for a long moment. I believe he devised the plan himself. I see no evidence of external conspiracy. Simpson's involvement was coincidental, foolish, but separate. Silas Brown, though opportunistic, was never part of Straker's scheme. He merely found the horse wandering the moor and seized his own chance to profit. Holmes paused again. No, Straker was alone in his intention, and alone in his fatal miscalculation. Watson remained silent, feeling the full weight of what Holmes had just said. In the corner of the room, the clock chimed softly, marking the passing of another hour. Outside, the distant sounds of preparation for the Wessex Cup could be heard, the clatter of hooves, the call of stable boys, the movement of horses being exercised in the paddocks. Holmes moved toward the door, retrieving his coat. Come, Watson. There is one final thing I must do today. Before this case closes, I need to see Silver Blaze with my own eyes and confirm a suspicion that has taken root. Watson followed, aware that they stood now at the threshold of the case's most critical revelation, and as they stepped out into the fading light of the day, the winds across Dartmoor carried with them the low, restless energy of a mystery nearing its end. The late afternoon sun cast golden light across the fields of Dartmoor, softening the rugged lines of the landscape and giving the moor an almost peaceful appearance. But Holmes, walking alongside Watson toward the far paddock where Silver Blaze stood grazing, felt anything but peace. His mind worked in sharp, deliberate turns, each thought drawing him closer to the final conclusion that had begun forming since the moment he first examined the body on the moor. Silver Blaze stood near the fence line, his powerful frame relaxed, ears flicking lazily as he pulled at the grass. The dye used to disguise him had been fully washed away now, and the horse's distinctive white blaze gleamed brightly across his dark face, as familiar as ever to those at King's Pyland. Holmes rested his arms on the top rail of the fence, studying the animal in silence. For several minutes, he said nothing. Watson, standing nearby, also remained still, sensing the gravity of the moment. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice low and contemplative. Watson, look at him. Observe the muscle along the hindquarters, the strength of the back legs. Consider the sheer force contained in those limbs. Watson nodded slowly. A single kick from an animal of this size, at full extension, could fracture bone as easily as snapping a twig. Exactly. Holmes turned away from the fence, motioning for Watson to walk with him back toward the house. By the time they reached Colonel Ross's study, both men had settled back into that familiar dynamic, Holmes leading the inquiry, Watson ready with notebook in hand. Holmes gestured for the colonel, Inspector Gregory, and several key staff members to gather. The room filled quickly, each person carrying a mixture of expectation and unease. The case had hovered over them for days now, and the need for answers pressed heavily on everyone. Holmes stood near the fireplace, one hand resting against the mantel as he began. "Gentlemen, we have reached the end of this investigation. The missing horse has been recovered. The chain of possession is clear, but there remains one question, the most serious of all. How did John Straker meet his death?" The room fell silent. Even the sound of shifting chairs and nervous coughs ceased. Holmes continued. "At first glance, the facts suggested murder, a man found dead on the moor, a single fatal blow to the head, a knife nearby, and a known bookmaker lingering suspiciously close to the scene. It was all too convenient, too easily explained." Holmes allowed the words to settle before moving on. But as we examined the evidence, inconsistencies appeared. The dog did not bark. The ground showed only Straker's footprints. There was no sign of another assailant. Inspector Gregory shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Holmes pressed on. "Then there is the matter of Straker's attire, fully dressed, polished boots, coat buttoned, and the knife, small, sharp, entirely unsuited for defense." Watson watched as the faces in the room began to change, confusion giving way to dawning realization. Holmes's voice grew stronger, more decisive. "Straker did not go to the moor that night by accident. He went with purpose. He took Silver Blaze from his stall under the cover of darkness, led the horse into the moor to a secluded spot beyond sight of the house." Holmes paused, meeting the eyes of each man in the room, and there, with the knife in hand, he knelt beside the horse, preparing to make a small, almost invisible incision to the animal's leg, enough to render Silver Blaze unable to race, but not enough to draw immediate suspicion. Colonel Ross, sitting rigid in his chair, shook his head in disbelief. "Straker? Impossible." Holmes turned toward him. "The evidence says otherwise, Colonel. Financial records show Straker was in debt, deeply and increasingly so. We have proof of secret purchases, a relationship in London, and the clear presence of motive." Inspector Gregory cleared his throat. "But the injury, how was it inflicted?" Holmes drew a slow breath. In that critical moment, as Straker reached toward the horse's hind leg with the knife, Silver Blaze, sensing the danger, reacting instinctively to the threat, lashed out with a powerful backward kick. Holmes mimicked the sudden motion with a sharp swing of his hand. The blow struck Straker at the base of the skull, instantly fatal. A hush fell over the room. Watson's mind rushed back to the shape of the wound, the singular nature of the injury, the location behind the ear, the absence of defensive wounds. Holmes continued. The horse, frightened and disoriented by the incident, bolted into the night. Hours later, he was found and taken in by Silas Brown, who, for reasons of his own, chose to conceal the animal. Colonel Ross leaned back in his chair, his face pale but composed. "It seems absurd, and yet it fits." Holmes gave a single nod. "It fits because it is true." The room remained silent for a long moment until finally Inspector Gregory stood. "Then, there will be no arrest?" Holmes shook his head. "No arrest. There is no crime here that remains, only misjudgment, and the fatal consequences of greed and desperation." Watson, observing the room, saw the inevitable mixture of emotions, relief from the colonel, confusion among the staff, and a solemn quiet from Inspector Gregory. As the gathering dispersed, Holmes stood alone by the window, looking once more toward the horizon, where the moor stretched endlessly away. Watson joined him there. "Holmes, you seem troubled, even now." Holmes's reply came quietly. "Cases like this, Watson, remind me that the greatest dangers do not always come from strangers, but from the small, silent betrayals we commit against our own better judgment." With that, Holmes collected his coat and hat. "Come, there is still the matter of Simpson's fate, and of course the Wessex Cup." And together the two men stepped out into the cool Dartmoor air, leaving behind the house, the staff, and the memory of a man whose secrets had led him unavoidably to his own ruin. By the time Holmes and Watson returned to the front parlor of Colonel Ross's house, the late afternoon light had already begun to fade, casting the room in a mellow golden hue. The air outside was crisp, and the windows showed faint traces of condensation as the temperature dropped with the approaching. Inspector Gregory sat waiting, reviewing his notes by lamplight. A half-empty cup of tea rested beside him, forgotten amid the clutter of papers and witness statements spread across the table. As Holmes entered, Gregory stood immediately, a look of expectation on his face. "Mr. Holmes, now that we have clarity regarding Straker's death, there remains the matter of Fitzroy Simpson, the opium, the attempted drugging. Surely he may face charges." Holmes moved toward the hearth, warming his hands briefly before turning to address the inspector directly. "Indeed, Inspector, the role of Mr. Simpson deserves our full attention." Holmes paused a moment, as though ordering his. "Let us revisit the facts surrounding Simpson's involvement. On the night in question, he was discovered loitering near the King's Pyland stables. He was found in possession of a small packet of opium laced, and, according to witness reports, was observed behaving in an anxious and erratic manner." Gregory nodded, and Holmes continued. His intent was clear. Simpson hoped to incapacitate Silver Blaze by drugging him, a crude, desperate act likely conceived under the weight of financial losses and the lure of betting gain. However, there are two crucial points to consider. Holmes began pacing slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. First, Simpson's position on the night of the incident. The evidence places him on the far side of the property, well away from the location where Straker met his death. His footprints, though found near the outer paddock, do not intersect with the trail that led Straker to the moor. Holmes turned, fixing Gregory with a steady gaze. Second, the behavior of the stable dog. The dog remained silent throughout the night. Had Simpson approached the stable door, the animal would almost certainly have barked. The absence of any such reaction strongly supports Simpson's claim that he never made it close enough to deliver the drugged meat. Watson, observing the inspector, saw the reluctant understanding begin to appear on Gregory's face. Holmes pressed on. Furthermore, Simpson's own statement, while self-serving, remains consistent. He admitted his plan, offered no resistance at the time of his arrest, and never once attempted to deny possession of the opium-laced food. Holmes gestured toward the papers on Gregory's desk. Simpson's crime is clear: attempted interference with the outcome of the race. A misdemeanor in the eyes of the law, certainly, but entirely unrelated to Straker's death. Gregory rubbed his temple, exhaling slowly. "So, we charge him with unlawful interference, attempted sabotage, but we absolve him of any role in the death." Holmes nodded. "That would be the proper course." Colonel Ross entered at that moment, having overheard the final portion of the discussion. "It galls me to think that Simpson walks away with nothing more than a fine or a short sentence, given the trouble he's caused." Holmes's tone remained even. "Colonel, sometimes the moral weight of failure is punishment enough." Mr. Simpson wagered heavily, both in coin and in conscience, and lost on both. Ross looked unconvinced, but said nothing further. Watson stepped forward. "Holmes, I keep coming back to one detail: the coincidence. Two separate men acting against the same horse on the same night, one trying to drug him, the other intending to injure him. It seems unlikely." Holmes smiled faintly, though there was little humor in it. "Coincidence, Watson, is often more common than we prefer to admit. The world rarely arranges its misfortunes neatly. Straker's plot and Simpson's foolish scheme happened to intersect, but only in proximity, not in cause." He turned back toward the window, where the last of the daylight bled away across the moor. "And in the end, it was neither of them who truly harmed Silver Blaze. Holmes paused for effect. The horse, defending himself, proved more effective than either of his would-be saboteurs. The room remained quiet as the weight of that statement settled over them. Holmes glanced at the clock on the mantel. "Come, Watson, the Wessex Cup is only days away. I suggest we turn our attention to ensuring that Silver Blaze arrives at the starting line in full health, and with no more surprises waiting for." Watson followed as Holmes gathered his hat and coat once more. As they stepped out into the Dartmoor evening, Watson could not help but reflect on the strange sequence of chance and motive that had brought them to this point. And somewhere in the distance, Silver Blaze stood quietly in his stall, unaware that his survival had already rewritten the fates of every man plotted against him. The following morning broke crisp and clear, with long beams of early sunlight cutting through the mist that lingered over Dartmoor. There was an unusual calm at King's Pond. The horses moved restless in their stalls, sensing the rising energy as the day of the Wessex Cup drew nearer. The grooms moved with quiet urgency, tending to final preparation. Yet amidst all this motion, one detail from the night of the crime still lingered like a loose thread in Holmes's mind: the silence of the dog. Holmes spent much of the morning walking alone along the perimeter of the stable yard. His coat buttoned tightly against the cold breeze, he stopped now and then to observe the stable dog itself, a large black mastiff that lay curled near the stable door, its tail flicking lazily whenever one of the familiar stable hands passed by. Watson, standing nearby, watched Holmes with curiosity. After all that had been uncovered in the past days, what more could Holmes possibly hope to learn from observing a dog that had done nothing? Holmes finally knelt beside the animal, speaking in low, measured tones. "A dog's silence, Watson, is often more revealing than its bark." Watson moved closer. "You've mentioned this before, but I confess, Holmes, I still struggle to see its full importance." Holmes stood dusting off his gloves. "Let me explain. The dog, as we know, was stationed here every night. Loyal, alert, known to bark at strangers and unfamiliar sounds." Watson nodded. "On the night in question," Holmes continued, "there was no barking, despite someone entering the stable, removing Silver Blaze, and leading him off into the dark." Holmes began pacing slowly along the path from the stable door toward the open moor. "This means only one thing. The person who entered that stable and led the horse away was known to the dog." Watson followed, trying to keep pace both physically and mentally, which rules out Simpson. Exactly. Holmes's tone grew more certain. Simpson was a stranger to the household. Even approaching the fence would have triggered the dog's alarm. But Straker was not a stranger. He was here every day. The dog trusted him. Holmes paused near the outer gate. It fits perfectly with what we now know. Straker had full access both to the stables and to the trust of every animal and man on this. When he entered that night, dressed for the day, carrying a surgical knife, leading Silver Blaze from his stall, the dog saw no threat, reason to bark. Watson stood silent for a moment, processing the clarity of in the end, Holmes. The dog's silence was not an absence of evidence, but evidence in itself. Holmes turned toward him, a small but satisfied smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Correct, Watson. Sometimes it is not the presence of action, but its absence, that speaks loudest." At that moment, Colonel Ross emerged from the far end of the yard, approaching quickly with the inspector trailing close behind. "Mr. Holmes," the colonel called out, "we've just received a message from the race officials. They've confirmed Silver Blaze's entry for the Wessex Cup. The horse will run." There was a new brightness in the colonel's face, a mixture of relief and quiet triumph. Holmes inclined his head politely. "Excellent news, Colonel. I would expect nothing less." Gregory, stepping forward, added his own comment. "We'll have Simpson formally charged today. I trust your findings on that matter Holmes's response was measured. "Proceed as you see fit, Inspector. But remember, the man's crime, while foolish, did not cost a life." Gregory nodded, then departed toward the carriage waiting near the gate. As the group began to disperse, Watson lingered beside Holmes. "One final detail. Why didn't you mention the dog's silence earlier?" Holmes smiled. "Because what? I needed the full picture first. Without knowing Straker's true role, the silence of the dog was just a riddle. Now, it is the final confirmation." Watson smiled faintly, scribbling the observation into his notebook. And with that, Holmes stepped away from the stable yard, his coat catching in the cool morning wind, leaving behind a trail of deduction that had begun with a missing and now pointed unerringly toward the complete and inevitable. The next day, with the Wessex, Holmes retreated to a small, quiet corner of Colonel Ross's. The study door remained closed for much of the morning, and when Watson entered just before noon, he found Holmes seated at the desk with a collection of letters, receipts, and personal documents spread out before him in careful, concentric order. Holmes sat with his head slightly bowed, his fingers steepled in front of his chin, staring at a single sheet of paper in the center of the arrangement. His expression was distant, but Watson could tell from the slow, deliberate tapping of his forefinger against his lower lip that Holmes's mind was burning through layers of analysis, stripping away the last remaining uncertainty. Watson moved quietly to sit nearby, waiting for Holmes to speak first. After several long moments, Holmes lifted his head. "Watson, the shape of this case has been human from the start. Every detail we've uncovered, every inconsistency, points not to random criminality, but to the complicated, layered decisions of a man fighting the slow collapse of his own life." Watson leaned forward, recognizing that Holmes was finally ready to reveal the extent of his deductions. It's Straker as he truly was, outwardly a respected and disciplined trainer, trusted by Colonel Ross, regarded by an ordinary working man, or so he allowed everyone to believe. But beneath that surface, something else had taken root. Holmes gestured toward a stack of papers. The financial records show a steady decline in solvency, withdrawals, small loans, pawning valuables, and, most notably, unexplained cash purchases over the past year. He picked up the milliner's bill again. Then there is the matter of Lydia Marks in London, a woman with no profession, no independent income, yet receiving frequent expensive deliveries from Straker, dress patterns, fabric, personal items. Do you believe she was blackmailing him? Holmes shook his head. No, this voluntary. A relationship maintained quietly, funded at a cost Straker could not sustain. His visits to London, discreet hotel stays, all point to an affair. A double life built on deception and concealed debt. Holmes stood pacing slowly across the room. Then, with the Wessex Cup approaching, Straker must have seen an opportunity. Injure the favorite, Silver Blaze, manipulate the betting market, and through carefully placed wagers, recover enough money to silence his creditors and continue his London indulgence. Holmes paused by the window, looking out across the fields where Silver Blaze stood, grazing. But ambition has its risks, Watson. Straker thought he could control every variable. The timing, the injury, the cover story. Yet the one thing he could not control was the horse. Holmes turned back, speaking with quiet intensity. In the critical moment, with Silver Blaze sensing danger, the animal reacted with the full power of instinct and survival. One violent kick, sudden, unforgiving. The end. Watson sat back, letting the full weight of the story settle in his mind. So, Straker's own greed and his unraveling double life led him directly to his death. Holmes nodded solemnly. Yes, a man pulled apart by financial desperation and personal dishonesty. And in trying to sabotage the one creature he was charged with protecting, he became the victim of his own plan. At that moment, Colonel Ross entered the sea. His expression was pale but resolute. "I've reviewed your findings, Mr. Holmes. It is difficult to I trusted that man. I relied on him. Colonel, sometimes the masks people wear are more complete than we imagine. And the woman in London?" Holmes set the papers. "I leave it to you whether you choose to pursue that matter further. Her involvement, though morally questionable, was not criminal." Ross gave a slow, weary nod, then left the room. As the door closed behind him, Watson turned back to Holmes. Another case solved. Holmes's gaze remained on the document. "Not solved, Watson." "Understood." Watson tilted his head. "There's a difference?" Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "Always." And with that, Holmes began gathering the papers, folding them into a neat pile. As the afternoon sun poured softly across the desk, illuminating the truth of a man's life that had, until now, remained carefully hidden in shadow. The following morning brought with it a sense of cautious optimism that had been absent from King's Pyland for many days. The household, once weighed down by anxiety and suspicion, now moved with restored energy. The grooms worked with renewed focus, the kitchen staff prepared meals with lighter conversation, and even the colonel, usually a figure of rigid discipline, appeared softened by the return of his prize horse. Holmes and Watson sat together on the veranda, overlooking the paddocks where Silver Blaze stood under the care of his handler. The horse moved with a natural grace, his coat restored to its original luster, the distinctive white. There was little sign that the animal had spent days hidden under a crude disguise, or that he had narrowly escaped becoming a victim of sabotage. Colonel Ross emerged from the house soon after breakfast, dressed impeccably, though the lines around his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights. As he approached Holmes and Watson, there was a visible release of tension in his shoulders, as though each step carried away some lingering burden. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I scarcely know how to thank you." Holmes rose from his chair. "You owe me nothing more than your attention to..." Ross's gaze drifted to where the horse's handlers walked him carefully along the training track. "It's remarkable, really. After everything, after days, missing, hidden, disguised, transported under questionable conditions, and yet there he stands, as strong as ever. No lameness, no visible injury." Holmes nodded. "Indeed, Colonel, I examined the horse myself. No swelling, no tenderness along the joints. His stride is clean, balanced. He shows no lasting effects from his time away." Ross exhaled slowly, a faint smile creeping across his. "To think, I nearly resigned myself to losing the cup. And now, we have our chance again." Holmes's expression remained neutral, but Watson could see the satisfaction in his eye. The conversation shifted, and Ross lowered his hand. "About Straker." Holmes's tone grew quieter as well. "The full truth is difficult to accept, Colonel, but I believe you now understand the events as they unfolded. Straker's actions, while concealed, were deliberate. His financial situation, his secret life, all led to a choice that cost him dearly." Ross's jaw tightened. "It's hard to reconcile. A man I trusted for years, a man who stood in my yard every morning, would betray me like this." Holmes allowed a brief pause. "Human nature is rarely simple, Colonel, and desperation can twist even the most familiar faces." The colonel nodded, though it was clear the emotional impact of the revelation would remain with him for some time. "What of Simpson?" Ross asked after a moment. Holmes gestured toward the road leading back toward Tavistock. "He'll answer for his crimes in court, but his involvement, as I've explained, was a distraction. His actions were foolish, but unrelated to Straker's death." Ross, such tangled threads, all converging at once. Holmes offered us. "That is often the nature of..." For a long moment the three men stood in companionable silence, watching as Silver Blaze continued his slow, measured laps around the training field. The horse moved with power and control, every step a promise of the performance he would soon deliver. Watson finally broke the "Colonel, when will you depart for the race?" "Tomorrow at first light," Ross replied. "The final leg of our preparations will take place at the Wessex track. I want him settled and rested before race day." Holmes adjusted his gloves. "In that case, Colonel, Watson and I will accompany you. I wish to observe Silver Blaze on the field and see with my own eyes the closing chapter of this affair." Ross's face lit with genuine appreciation. "I would be honored, Mr. Holmes." With plans made, the group dispersed, each man carrying his own reflections on the strange, tragic, and narrowly avoided disaster that had unfolded on Dartmoor. As Watson returned to the house to pack his belongings, he felt a growing sense of anticipation. For all the darkness and deception they had unraveled, the sight of Silver Blaze alive, strong, and poised to race again brought with it an undeniable feeling of victory. And for once, Watson thought as he glanced back at Holmes, this case, while tragic in parts, might still conclude with a moment of triumph. The journey from Dartmoor to the Wessex Cup grounds was made under clear skies, with a light breeze brushing through the countryside as Holmes, Watson, and Colonel Ross traveled by private carriage. The mood inside the carriage was unlike any of their previous excursions. Where earlier journeys had been marked by tension and unspoken fear, this one carried a quiet sense of relief and expectation. Even Colonel Ross, still grieving the betrayal by his trusted trainer, showed glimpses of hopefulness as he spoke occasionally of Silver Blaze's conditioning and previous victories. Watson, seated by the window, watched as the rolling hills gave way to flatter, more cultivated land. The small villages along the way were already stirring with excitement over the upcoming race. Colorful banners hung from shop fronts, and groups of men gathered near taverns, discussing odds with the exaggerated certainty only racing enthusiasts could muster. Upon arriving at the Wessex Cup grounds, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The field was alive with noise and color. Vendors shouted from their stalls, selling everything from meat pies to betting slips. Ladies in bright dresses moved through the crowd with parasols raised against the midday sun. The grandstands were already filling with spectators, merchants, farmers, and well-dressed gentlemen from London, all mingling in noisy anticipation. Holmes stood near the paddock rail, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd, noting familiar faces and new ones with equal attention. Watson remained at his side, absorbing the energy of the event, feeling the excitement stir in his chest despite the grim nature of the investigation that had brought them here. Colonel Ross stood a few yards away, speaking quietly with his jockey and stable staff. Though outwardly composed, his hand never strayed far from the watch chain on his waistcoat, checking the time every few minutes. As the starting hour drew near, Silver Blaze stood in the preparation area, gleaming in the sun, his coat smooth and immaculate. His ears flicked at the sounds of the crowd, but he remained calm, his powerful legs shifting with contained energy. Holmes stepped closer to observe the horse for several minutes, his gaze traveling slowly over each leg, each joint, each muscle. Satisfied, Holmes turned to Watson. "He is in perfect condition, better, perhaps, than any of his competitors here." Watson smiled. "After all he has been through, it is remarkable." Holmes nodded, though his expression remained distant, thoughtful. Minutes later, a bell rang out across the grounds, signaling the jockeys to mount and the horses to proceed toward the starting line. The crowd surged toward the railings, cheers and wagers rising in a wave of human noise. Holmes and Watson took their places along the front row, just behind the colonel, who stood rigid, hands clasped tightly behind his back, staring at the track with unblinking intensity. Watson glanced at the betting board nearby where Silver Blaze, recent mystery surrounding him, remained the strong favorite among those who believed in his return. Holmes leaned close to Watson, speaking just above the roar of the crowd. If ever a horse carried with him the full weight of circumstance and expectation, it is Silver Blaze today. Watson smiled tightly. Do you think he feels it, Holmes? Holmes allowed the faintest curve of a smile. Animals are more perceptive than we give them credit for, Watson. I believe he knows exactly what is at stake. A moment later, the starter's flag dropped. The horses sprang from the gates with a thunderous release of motion. Silver Blaze leapt forward with astonishing speed, breaking cleanly from the line, his hooves pounding against the turf in a blur of controlled power. From the first quarter mile, it was clear that Silver Blaze held command over the field. The other horses strained to keep pace, but none could match his stride. The distance between him and the second-place runner grew with each furlong, the crowd erupting in cheers that rose in a wave of astonishment. Watson gripped the railing, heart pounding in his chest as he shouted along with the others. Colonel Ross stood frozen in place, too overwhelmed to speak, his gaze locked on the finish line. In less than 2 minutes, it was over. Silver Blaze crossed the finish with a commanding lead, leaving the nearest competitor trailing by several lengths. The grandstand erupted into a deafening roar. Colonel Ross exhaled sharply, removing his hat and holding it at his side as though releasing weeks of pent-up worry in one silent, breathless moment. Holmes stood calm, his face neutral, but Watson saw the satisfaction in his eyes. The case, though dark in its detail, had reached a kind of poetic closure. As the officials declared Silver Blaze the winner, Watson turned to Holmes. Well, Holmes, I dare say this is one of your most satisfying conclusions. Holmes gave a slight nod, still watching that the truth always finds its. Watson laughed softly at the line, but behind the humor, he understood the deeper meaning. As Silver Blaze was led back toward the winner's enclosure, cheered by hundreds of voices, Holmes turned away from the track, already moving toward the exit. Come, Watson. There remains one final conversation before this case is truly Watson followed, knowing full well that Holmes never left a single thread untied. Later that evening, as the celebrations surrounding Silver Blaze's victory began to quiet, Holmes, Watson, and Colonel Ross retired to the Colonel's private lounge at the Wessex Cup grounds. The room was warm, the air filled with the faint smell of cigar smoke and brandy. A soft murmur drifted from the distant banquet hall, where guests still celebrated the day's triumph. Yet here, in this smaller, more intimate setting, the mood turned once again to the events that had led them all to this. Colonel Ross stood near the sideboard, pouring himself a modest glass of brandy, his hands no longer trembling as they had days before. Watson sat in an armchair near the hearth, and Holmes, as always, remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the mantel. Colonel Ross turned toward Holmes with an expression that blended gratitude and lingering confusion. Mr. Holmes, you've returned my horse, exposed the truth about Straker, and saved my reputation. But I confess, there are still parts of this case I cannot fully grasp. Holmes inclined his head, his tone measured and calm. Then, let me explain, Colonel. From the beginning to the end. Holmes stepped away from the mantel, pacing slowly as the case began with 2 crimes. That appeared to be one, the disappearance of Silver Blaze and the death of John Straker. Naturally, everyone assumed both were caused by the same hand, but that was never true. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. Fitzroy Simpson, desperate gambler, devised a crude plan to drug Silver Blaze with opium-laced meat, hoping to influence the race. He lurked near the stables, waiting for his chance, but in the end, he never got close enough. The stable dog's silence on the night in question tells us that. The dog knew Simpson was not near the stables because it didn't react. Holmes turned toward Colonel Ross. Straker, on the other hand, was no innocent. His secret debts, his double life in London, forced him toward a darker plan. Using his trusted position, he entered the stable after the household had gone to bed. The dog, knowing him, stayed silent. Straker led Silver Blaze out onto the moor, far enough that any noise or disturbance would go unnoticed. Holmes lifted the small surgical knife from the table beside him, holding it between two fingers. His weapon, chosen carefully, small, sharp, designed for precise work, the kind of tool suitable for making a subtle, almost invisible cut to the horse's tendon. Enough to ruin Silver Blaze's chances without attracting suspicion. Watson, seated nearby, nodded, remembering Holmes's earlier deduction. And yet, Holmes continued, Straker miscalculated one crucial thing. He paused, turning to gaze out the window, where, under the moonlight, the racecourse stretched quietly into the distance. He underestimated the animal. Holmes faced them again. Silver Blaze, startled, sensing danger, reacted as any animal would, a powerful, instinctive kick. The blow struck Straker at the base of the skull, instantly fatal. No struggle, no time for defense. Colonel Ross stood silent, his expression caught between horror and understanding. But what of the horse after that? Ross finally asked. Holmes placed the knife back on the table. Frightened and alone, Silver Blaze bolted into the moor. Silas Brown, opportunistic as ever, found him. Realizing the value of what he had stumbled upon, Brown concealed the horse at Mapleton Stables, going so far as to disguise him with dye to prevent recognition. Watson interjected, "And your confrontation with Brown?" Holmes smiled. Simple. I presented him with the inevitable consequence, then offered him a way out. His fear. Colonel Ross set his glass down, looking at Holmes with genuine admiration. And Simpson. Holmes's tone softened, guilty of attempted sabotage, but innocent of any blood on his hands. His punishment in the end will be light. For a moment, none of them spoke. The room settled into a comfortable, almost reflective. Finally, Watson asked the question that lingered in his own mind. Holmes, was there ever a moment when you doubted the outcome? Holmes's gaze drifted back toward the fire, his voice lower now. There is always doubt, Watson. Doubt sharpens the mind, forces it to work harder, to discard what is convenient and pursue what is true. Colonel Ross stepped forward. Well, Mr. Holmes, whatever your methods, I am forever in your debt. Holmes inclined his head modestly. My reward, Colonel, is the satisfaction of seeing the truth And with that, Holmes moved toward the door, retrieving his coat. And come, Watson, I believe our work here is done. Watson followed, glancing once more at the colonel, who remained near the hearth staring into the fire, a man who had nearly lost everything but whose fortune had been restored. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Holmes's silhouette disappeared into the fog with steady, unhurried steps, and somewhere in the distance, Silver Blaze rested in his stall, the champion who had, without knowing it, written the final line of a mystery no man could have predicted. The morning after the Wessex Cup, the air around the racecourse remained electric with stories of the previous day's unexpected but decisive victory. Newspapers from London to Exeter carried headlines praising Silver Blaze's performance, labeling it one of the most remarkable wins in recent racing history. Bettors who had placed faith in the horse collected their winnings with wide grins, while others nursed their loss resigned. Yet, as public excitement swirled, Holmes remained focused on one final loose end, the man whose cooperation, though reluctant and self-serving, had played a quiet but critical role in the safe return of Silver Blaze, Silas Brown. Holmes arranged a private meeting with Brown in a small office adjacent to the race grounds. It was a sparsely furnished space with a single wooden desk, 2 worn chairs, and the lingering smell of tobacco and horse leather. Brown arrived just after 10 in the morning, escorted by a local constable at Holmes' quiet request. Brown entered the room cautiously, his shoulders tense, his eyes darting with the same mix of defiance and fear that Holmes had seen during their first confrontation at Mapleton. Holmes greeted him with a nod, but wasted no time in addressing the matter at hand. "Mr. Brown, you understand why you are here?" Brown shifted uncomfortably in the chair provided for him. "I've done what you asked, Holmes. The horse was returned, unharmed, just as you wanted." Holmes's gaze remained fixed and steady. "That is true. And for that, you've bought yourself a measure of leniency." Brown swallowed hard. "So, that's it then? We're done?" Holmes leaned forward, resting his hands lightly on the desk between them. "Almost." Brown stiffened. Holmes continued, his voice low but deliberate. "You concealed a stolen racehorse on your property. You altered his appearance. You did so with the full knowledge that this was unlawful, and that by keeping Silver Blaze hidden, you could manipulate the outcome of the Wessex Cup." Brown opened his mouth to protest, but Holmes raised a hand to stop him. "Spare me any rehearsed excuses. The facts are plain." However, Holmes paused just long enough for the word to sink in. "Your cooperation, though motivated by fear, prevented further harm to the horse, and by complying with my instructions, you ensured that Silver Blaze was returned in time to compete and win." Brown's breathing grew shallow. Watson, standing near the door, observed how the man's face remained tight with anxiety, waiting for the inevitable judgment. Holmes continued, "I have already spoken with Inspector Gregory. Given the circumstance and the fact that your actions did not directly contribute to Straker's death, I will recommend that no formal charge." Brown's head jerked up, disbelief flashing across his face. You'll do that?" Holmes nodded once, with 2 conditions. Brown blinked rapidly. "Name them." "First," Holmes said, "you will submit a full written statement outlining every action you took regarding Silver Blaze, from the moment you found him wandering the moor to the moment you delivered him back. Full disclosure, no omissions." Brown nodded quickly. "Done." "Second," Holmes's tone hardened, "you will sever all ties with anyone connected to illegal betting practices, any future involvement in matters of sabotage, bribery, or race manipulation, and I will personally see to it that you are prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Brown swallowed again, visibly pale. "I understand." Holmes sat back. "Good. Then we have nothing more to discuss." Brown stood slowly, still unsteady on his feet, then glanced toward Watson, as if expecting some further comment. Receiving none, he turned and left the room, escorted once more by the constable. As the door closed behind him, Watson turned to Holmes. "You're letting him go?" Holmes adjusted his gloves, already preparing to depart. "For now, Watson. Brown is a man who understands consequence. The fear of exposure and the memory of this week will be punishment enough to keep him straight, at least for a time." Watson gathered his coat. "You're trusting him?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I trust in human self-preservation." As they stepped out into the bright morning sun, the sounds of the racecourse behind them began to fade. Holmes's steps were light, his coat catching the breeze, his mind already shifting away from Dartmoor and onto whatever mystery would next demand his attention. For Silas Brown, his role in this affair had ended, but for Holmes and Watson, the road ahead remained, as always, open and unpredictable. In the days following the Wessex Cup, as Dartmoor settled back into its quiet rhythm and the excitement of the race faded into memory, Holmes and Watson remained at King's Pyland for a final round of formalities. Though the primary threads of the case had been tied, there remained the small but important matter of Fitzroy Simpson. On the morning after Silver Blaze's celebrated victory, Inspector Gregory arrived at the colonel's estate with a set of official papers in hand. The document detailed the charges to be brought against Simpson, an effort that had been delayed until Holmes could personally advise on them. Holmes reviewed the document carefully, standing by the drawing room window where the light was strongest. Watson sat nearby, watching the familiar lines of concentration return to Holmes's face as he scanned each paragraph. Gregory waited, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, knowing Holmes's opinion would heavily influence how Scotland Yard proceeded. After several long moments, Holmes lowered the papers. Inspector, while Simpson's behavior was undeniably reckless and criminal in intent, I must stress again that his actions, while deserving of penalty, had no connection to Straker's death. Gregory nodded, though the inspector's personal opinion of Simpson remained less forgiving. Holmes continued, "He attempted to interfere with the outcome of a race by using illicit means. That is a fact. But his crime was that of an opportunist, a man driven by financial desperation, not violence." Watson, looking up from his seat, added his own observation, "And it seems he was more a danger to himself than to anyone else." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Indeed, Watson." Turning back to Gregory, Holmes spoke with finality. "I recommend a charge of attempted race interference and possession of a controlled substance, nothing more. The court will likely impose a fine, perhaps a short sentence in local jail, but given the broader facts of this case, there's little to gain in making an example of it." Gregory, though reluctant, made a note in his ledger. "Understood." Later that day, Simpson was brought from his holding cell in Tavistock to meet with the local magistrate. Watson accompanied Holmes to observe the hearing. Simpson entered the small, wood-paneled courtroom with slumped shoulders, looking thinner and more worn than when they had first seen him on the moor. The charges were read aloud: unlawful possession of a controlled substance, attempted interference with a public sporting event, and trespassing on private property. To each, Simpson offered no defense. He stood quietly, answering only with soft, almost mechanical words, "Guilty." Watson watched the man closely, noting the hollow look in Simpson's eyes, the face of a man who had gambled with both money and luck, and lost it both. The magistrate, perhaps influenced by Holmes's written statement, delivered a modest sentence: a fine payable within 30 days and 2 weeks in county jail. As the room cleared, Simpson was escorted away without protest. Outside the courthouse, Watson turned to Holmes. "Do you think that will be enough to keep him straight in the future?" Holmes stood for a moment, his gaze distant. "Men like Simpson rarely learn, Watson. His type moves from one risky scheme to another, always chasing fortune, always a step behind consequence. But for now, he poses no further threat." Watson nodded. "And with that, the final piece falls into place." Holmes smiled faintly, adjusting his coat. "For this case, at least." Together, they turned away from the courthouse, the cool afternoon air stirring the dust along the village road. Behind them, the quiet town resumed its daily life, oblivious to the tangle of motives and mistakes that had unfolded just days before on the cold, dark moor. For Simpson, for Brown, and for all others touched by the mystery of Silver Blaze, the chapter had closed. And for Holmes and Watson, it was time to return to London. The journey back to London took place under a calm, cloudless sky. As the train pulled steadily away from the quiet fields of Devonshire, Watson sat across from Holmes in their first-class compartment, gazing out at the landscape slipping past the window. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the rails filled the space between them. Yet for once, Watson found the silence companionable rather than awkward. Holmes sat comfortably, legs crossed, eyes half. But Watson could tell from the faint, almost imperceptible tapping of Holmes's fingertips against his knee that his mind remained quietly engaged. Watson opened his notebook, letting it rest. For several minutes he hesitated, unsure whether to break the peace. Finally, unable to suppress the thought, he spoke. "Holmes, I must say, this case has been one of your most remarkable." Holmes opened one eye lazily. "Oh? And what prompts such high praise, Watson?" Watson smiled. "The sheer variety of it, I suppose. There were so many moving parts. The missing horse, the murder, or rather the death on the moor, the peculiar silence of the dog, Simpson's foolish schemes, Silas Brown's opportunism, and of course, Straker's own tragic plan." Watson paused, then added with quiet sincerity, "To pull all of that together, to see the connections where no one else could, it's extraordinary." Holmes gave a small, self-deprecating smile but did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the passing countryside, letting several moments slip by before speaking again. "Watson, do you recall what I said to you years ago when you first began documenting my cases?" Watson tilted his head. "You said that the world is full of obvious things nobody ever observes." Holmes nodded faintly. "Precisely. This case, perhaps more than any other, stands as proof of that principle." Watson closed his notebook gently. The dog silenced for. Holmes smiled at that, but there was no boastfulness in his expression, only a quiet satisfaction. Yes, the dog's silence, a small thing, easily overlooked, and yet it was the fulcrum upon which the whole case turned. It told us more than a dozen witness statements or piles of circumstantial evidence ever could. Watson leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. And Straker's double life, the woman in London, the debts. It all seems so clear now. In hindsight, Holmes nodded. But at the time, Watson, it was buried beneath layers of distraction. A gambler in the area, a missing horse, a corpse on the moor, all of it designed, in a way, to pull the eye away from the true center of the case. Watson laughed softly. "And yet," Holmes shrugged modestly, "not at first, but the facts, when properly examined, always." For a few minutes, the two men sat in silence again, the train carving its way through fields and small villages, the occasional puff of smoke from the engine curling past the window. Finally, Watson spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Do you ever tire of it, Holmes? The constant analysis, the endless pursuit of motive and method?" Holmes opened both eyes now, looking directly at him. "No, Watson. I tire of human folly and of cruelty, but never of the truth." Watson smiled, satisfied with the answer. As the train sped onward toward London, Watson felt the familiar mix of admiration and curiosity that always followed one of Holmes's great cases. He closed his notebook, tucking it safely into his satchel, already composing in his mind the full account he would one day write for the public. An account that would, of course, include the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, and the brilliant deductive mind that had solved yet another mystery. And across from him, Holmes sat with eyes half-lidded once more, already drifting into that light, reflective state that often followed the close of a content for now, though never for. As the train rolled steadily toward London, Holmes and Watson remained seated in their compartment, each absorbed in quiet thought. The sun had begun to lower over the English countryside, casting long, golden streaks of light across the cabin. The rhythmic hum of the train wheels created a soothing but Watson's mind was still restless, circling back to the moments that had defined After some time, Watson reopened his notebook and began leafing through his notes, pausing when he reached the page where he had scribbled a particular exchange that had stuck with him since its first utterance. He tapped the paper thoughtfully with his pen before speaking. "Holmes, there is something I must ask." Holmes, seated across from him, opened one eye, his gaze mildly curious, but not yet fully engaged. "Yes, Watson." Watson cleared his throat, reading aloud from his own notes. "Is there any point to which you would wish to draw my attention?" Holmes's other eye opened, and a small smile touched the corners of his mouth as he recognized the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. Watson smiled, continuing without looking up from the dog did nothing. Holmes responded without pause, his voice low but clear. "That was the curious incident." Watson closed his notebook slowly, resting his hands. "Of all your deductions, that one, it stays with me. The simplicity, the elegance, how such an absent thing most of us even notice, became the turning point for everything that followed." Holmes's smile widened just as his tone remained measured. "It is often the absence, not the presence, that reveals them. People expect clues to announce themselves with noise, with drama, but more often they whisper, or in this case, they remain perfectly silent." Watson said, absorbing the meaning behind the words. The phrase, that small exchange between them, seemed to take on new weight with every passing mile, as the countryside blurred by and the lights of London began to grow brighter. For Watson, the quote would become one of the most memorable lines of Holmes's career, and he knew, when he eventually wrote the full account for the public, that these few sentences would be the ones readers would pause or reread. As the train began to slow on its final approach into the city, Holmes reached for his coat and hat. "Come, Watson, London awaits, and no doubt, so does our next." Watson followed, tucking his notebook safely into his bag. Yet as he stepped down onto the platform behind Holmes, one line echoed again and again in his mind. The dog did nothing in the nighttime, and in that nothing had lived the answer all along. The streets of London buzzed with the late afternoon crowd as Holmes and Watson stepped off the train at Paddington Station. The city, restless as always, seemed unaware of the dramatic events that had unfolded days earlier on the remote moorlands of Dartmoor. Carriages rattled along the cobblestones, newspaper boys called out headlines, and the thick scent of coal smoke lingered in the air. Watson followed Holmes through the busy terminal, keeping pace as they made their way toward Baker Street. The familiar routine of city life, the shifting crowds, the noise, the constant forward motion, felt almost surreal after the quiet tension of the countries. By the time they arrived at 201 Home B. Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson greeted them warmly at the door, ushering them inside with the comfort and familiarity of old friends, returning from another chapter in their unusual lives. "Your telegrams are waiting for you, Mr. Holmes." Handing over a small stack of Holmes accepted the letters but placed them aside without opening them, clearly still mentally settled on. Watson settled into his favorite armchair, and Holmes poured himself a modest glass of brandy, standing by the fireplace with his back to the room, staring into the flickering flames. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Watson finally broke the silence. "Holmes, this case, it had every element, did it not? Disguise, deception, secret lives, even a fatal miscalculation." Holmes turned, his expression thoughtful but satisfied. "It did, Watson, and it serves as a reminder that crime and tragedy rarely wear a single face." Watson nodded, then allowed himself a small, wry smile. "And I suspect that quote about the dog will find its way into your legacy, whether you like it or not." Holmes chuckled softly at the rare sound of genuine amusement in his voice. "Let them quote it if they wish. If it teaches even one reader to observe rather than assume, have served its purpose. Holmes crossed to his desk, sorting through the unopened letters. As he worked, Watson retrieved his notebook and opened a fresh page, the heading already forming in his mind: The Adventure of Silver Blaze. Watson wrote the first few lines, recalling with careful detail the mist over Dartmoor, the body on the moor, the missing horse, the strange silence of the dog, and the inevitable, unstoppable logic of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes glanced over his shoulder as Watson wrote. "Be kind, Watson. Spare me the heroic embellishments this time." Watson smiled without looking up. "Only the truth, Holmes, as always." Holmes moved to the window, drawing the curtain aside to gaze out over Baker Street. The gas lamps were already flickering to life, illuminating the city with soft golden light. Somewhere out there, Holmes knew, another puzzle waited, another twist of human behavior, another crime concealed behind ordinary faces and forgotten details. But for tonight, there was peace. Watson closed his notebook with a soft snap, laying it on the small table beside his chair. He reached for his pipe, lit it carefully, and sat back in quiet silence. The case of Silver Blaze complete at last.